And he goes there, and instead it's this LSD entrenched.
You're picking this guy over Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Da Vinci?
He said brilliant things, man. If you read his work was brilliant. It was brilliant. He was out of his fucking mind. I mean, he was out of his fucking mind, doing acid, shooting windows. He was crazy. There's a video of him having a shootout with his neighbors in Colorado. They're shooting at each other. It was crazy. Like, legitimately, he killed himself.
That goes with your morbid Instagram things with your friend.
No, it doesn't necessarily, because I think if I could catch him when he was young, I bet he'd be a fascinating guy to talk to. I just think you can't drink that hard for that long. You just deteriorate, and things go sideways mentally. It's just very, very, very bad for you. You're poisoning yourself every day with Coke, and you're poisoning yourself every day with whiskey. And that's this guy. There's a video of us reading Hunter S. Thompson's list of what this journalist saw him do in a day. This journalist came to Woody Creek, Colorado, where he lived, and us talking about it made its way into a song. Who is that band that did that? So it's like a techno dance song.
Wow.
That's all about Hunter S. Thompson's list of stuff he did.
Like when were you reading that? Like
that was a few years back.
Okay.
It was me and Greg Fitzsimmons were reading it. We were like, this is the craziest thing. Listen to the Beardy Man.
Featuring Joe Rogan.
Can we play this? That's ridiculous. It's my own words.
Oh, in terms of copyright?
What happens when you play it? What do you hear? Just us saying it? Okay, so it's the problem is the music?
I have to cut it out of the show. That's the problem.
Okay. See if you can find the actual clip of me and Greg talking about it. There's probably a clip of it. But it was, it's such a ridiculous, amount of substances he's consuming in a day. It's fucking insane. Like, he was insane.
So what makes him interesting is that he's insane and he consumes a lot of alcohol and drugs.
No.
Has it been 5 years?
He's a brilliant guy. Like, the things that he said were brilliant. Daily routine, 3 p.m., rise. Okay. He woke up at 3 p.m. and he like starts his day with whiskey, cocaine. It's like he's a fucking animal, man. He's an animal. But he was also a brilliant writer, man. He had an amazing insight, and he's a guy that sort of was soured by the shift from the 1960s to the 1970s and like what happened in this country. And how weird things.
So you could have had a chat. I mean, he only died recently, right?
Yeah, he died quite a while ago. He committed suicide at least 10 years ago, right?
Okay, but I mean, technically you could have met him.
Could have. Yeah, would have been possible. But even then, it was like the end of his...
Okay.
He wasn't the same guy. He wasn't the same guy as he was. 50, another glass of Chivas, another Dunhill. Here's his daily routine. 3 p.m., rise. 3:05, Chivas Regal with morning papers. Smokes Dunhills. 3:45, cocaine. 3:50, another glass of Chivas, another Dunhill. 4:05 p.m., by the way, first cup of coffee and a Dunhill. 4:15, cocaine. 4:16, orange juice and another Dunhill. 4:30, cocaine. 4:54, cocaine. 5:05, cocaine. 5:11, coffee, Dunhills. 5:30, get more ice in the Chivas. Cocaine at 5:45. 6 o'clock, smoking grass, take the edge off the day. 7 p.m.
The day, 3 hours into it.
3 hours in, lit. 7:05, Woody Creek Tavern for lunch. Heineken, 2 margaritas, coleslaw, a taco salad, double order of fried onion rings, carrot cake, ice cream, a bean fritter, Dunhills, another Heineken, cocaine. And for the rest of the ride home, a snow cone, a glass of shredded ice, which is poured over 4 jiggers of Chivas. Okay, so the snow cone is Chivas, okay? 9 p.m., start snorting cocaine seriously, it says. 10 p.m., drops acid. 11 p.m., chartreuse, I don't know what that is, cocaine and grass. 11:30, cocaine, etc., etc. 12, midnight, Hunter S. Thompson is ready to write. That's when he sits down to write. 12:05 to 6 a.m., he writes. Chartreuse, cocaine, grass, Chivas, coffee, Heineken, clove cigarettes, grapefruit, Dunhill's, orange juice, gin, continuous pornographic movies. 6 a.m., in the hot tub with champagne, Dove bars, fettuccine Alfredo. 8 a.m., Halcyon, which is a sleeping pill. 8:20, sleep. So he would take a sleeping pill at 8:20 in the morning. after riding it
Wow.
Would I love it?
Wow.
Now, if his writing sucked, that's crazy.
But
But his writing was
what
amazing.
was he? He wrote. He was a fiction writer?
No, it was he came up with a kind of journalism that was like journalism mixed with fiction, and he called it like gonzo journalism. Like where
Oh, I
some
know
of the
that.
things-
That's him. Okay,
That's him.
That's okay. I
and
got it.
The way he would write would be like over the top ridiculous to the point where he thought everybody knew he was joking, but it was mixed up in like
Right.
also real stuff like Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. You know, he was on the campaign trail and he spread a rumor about this guy who was a candidate for president being a drug addict on this exotic Brazilian drug ibogaine. And so people started believing it. The guy started having a mental breakdown, and he was on the Dick Cavett show, and he admitted to doing this. He admitted to spreading the rumor. He's like,
We made it all up. I couldn't believe people really believed that Muskie was eating ibogaine. I never said he was. I said there was a rumor in Milwaukee that he was, which was true. I started the rumor in Milwaukee.
He affected the campaign. It affected.
I'm assuming he wasn't married. He wasn't married. Was he married?
he was married,
Oh, he was,
yeah.
Okay, because all that cocaine and stuff might get into the.
Well, you know, you gotta do what you gotta do in this world. I don't know.
Fair enough.
Obviously, it didn't work out.
Yeah.
But he was a fucking maniac. He was a complete maniac. But especially in his younger days, like Hell's Angels is an amazing book. It's crazy. That's a crazy book. He was embedded with the Hell's Angels.
Wow.
And wrote this book, and they were real mad at him afterwards. And it's a crazy.
Oh, I know where I know him from. I think I read Tucker Carlson's biography because the guy who wrote it came on my show, so I read it in preparation, and I think Tucker Carlson refers to him. That's where I learned the term gonzo journalism, I think.
Probably. I think doesn't Tucker have like a Hunter S. Thompson story?
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Because when you said Hell's Angels, I know that Tucker had been invited to go give a talk with the Hell's Angels where he referenced some, and I think it's this guy. So now I'm linking what
That
you're
makes
talking
sense.
about.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like I don't know the story, but I think Tucker has a Hunter S. Thompson story, like he knew him. Oh, I feel like I've known Hunter S. Thompson for most of my
There you
life.
go.
I first encountered him in 1981 when I was 12. Tucker Carlson. Wow.
Jamie, would we say that out of my 10 appearances on the show, this has been the most number of times that you've come in with some truth? I'm going to say yes.
Damn. Dropping bombs.
Dropping
I don't
bombs.
have any research on the number of pull-ups I've done.
Yeah, you're obsessed with numbers.
I'm academic.
Yeah.
We quantify things.
It makes sense. But
Yeah.
in this world, that can be problematic. I don't know if you know that math is racist.
I do. By the way, 7 or 8 years ago, you could pull it up. Jamie can pull it up. I did a satirical clip where I introduced a new field that I was coining as social justice mathematics. And I went through all of these mathematical properties and said how we should get rid of them. Like irrational numbers should not exist because they marginalize mental illness, whatever. And I just went through the whole list. It became a big hit amongst the crowd of mathematicians, which is kind of a geeky crowd. But 7, 8 years later, reality caught up with my prophetic satire. Now it is literally the case that there is a field called sort of social justice mathematics where you talk about math being racist. So
There's a lot of grifters in this world, kids. And there's a lot of people that believe things, if left unchallenged and those things become doctrine, they're a real problem because they're not based in logic. They're just based in nonsense. They're based in occult-like thinking. That is, we're very susceptible to cult-like thinking.
yeah, I watched yesterday on my way to Austin a documentary 3-part series on these, I think it's called Ivy Ridge School. Have you heard of it?
Ivy Ridge School.
It was in Ogdenburg or something in upstate New York. They had a whole bunch of those schools where they would take kids, many of whom were not delinquents really, but they would convince their parents, because you mentioned cult, so this was kind of a cult situation. They would convince their parents that they need to send them to these boarding schools in order to, provide them with structure and discipline so that they can
Get their life together.
Get their life together. Even though many of them, had committed very, very minor. In fact, they were caught once with marijuana. These were not like, dropping acid all day long. And the things that they would do to them in these schools is straight out of, the worst Soviet gulags you could think of. And they're throughout the United States. And it's a form of cult indoctrination where you're doing cult indoctrination at two levels. To the captives in the schools, but you also have to convince the parents that they're doing the right thing by sending their kids there. It's unbelievable. You should watch this documentary. It behooves you to imagine that in the 21st century in the United States, these things can occur, but it really does. Oh, there you go. Exactly. There you go.
Netflix came out 2
That's
months ago.
crazy.
It's You're not allowed to have eye contact with another student. You're not allowed to smile. You're not allowed to look out the window. You're not allowed to speak to anyone. You just sit in front of a computer and you just do these.
Oh my God, that's
and they were in there for like 28 months. Then they gave them degrees, diplomas, high school diplomas that were fraudulent. So imagine you're sent there. And by the way, in some cases, they would come and kidnap you out of your parents' home because they knew that the kid would be resistant to leave. They said, no, it's completely legal. So like 2 goons would come, take your child, take them to upstate New York. The kid has no idea why I'm there.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so it's very powerful. So, and hence that's why parasitic thinking, right? Our ability to be parasitized is infinite.
That is crazy. That story's crazy.
Yeah, definitely check it out.
Oh my God.
So how old are your kids now? Speaking of kids, are they past the age where you have any influence on them? They think you're no longer the hero, you've become a zero? Because my children are entering at that stage.
That's
stage.
to be expected, and they're correct. They find flaws in your game. Yeah. It's fascinating to watch little minds develop their view of the world. And if there's anything that I've ever done, like a real 180 on, is I developed this weird way of looking at people, and it made me much more empathetic, where I don't think of people as just you at age, whatever you are. You at age 49, you at age 30. I think of everybody as babies. I think of everybody as that you used to be a little baby.
Right.
And a bunch of shit went terribly wrong.
Right.
And now here we are together in this unfortunate situation. And where I used to just think, like, if I saw some guy who's drunk and he's 35 years old, some asshole, it's like, he's just an asshole. This guy's an asshole. He's rude to people. What happened?
Yeah.
How did he get to that spot? And then I started thinking about people like little babies. These little babies that just got a bunch of bad things bad people, and bad environments.
But that's removing people's personal agency. That you're.
It's it's definitely removing it a little, which is also bullshit.
Yeah.
Because you do have personal agency, but you don't have 100%.
So I see.
There's certain landscapes that are untraversable.
I actually faced what you faced with a 35-year-old. I faced something similar on my daily walk with my wife to the coffee shop and back. There's a gentleman that stands outside this, kind of shishi artisanal butcher place in our neighborhood, and he is soliciting money every day, all day. Okay, he doesn't look as though he's mentally ill. He doesn't look completely destitute, but he stands there every day. And so now I just say hello to him just to recognize him, and you could tell that it means a lot to him. Hi, how are you? How you doing? And I've struggled with whether it would be appropriate for me or not to just strike up a conversation out of just a human interest in knowing what happened to you. Because he clearly doesn't seem like he's mentally ill. He doesn't seem as though he's a drug addict. I mean, he's not wearing a 3-piece Italian suit, but, he's not disheveled. And yet he's there every day, and that's the best option he has. Do you think it would be viewed by him as insulting and offensive if I were to speak to him, or on the contrary, hey, somebody's actually taking an interest in me? How do you view this?
It really depends upon the situation, and how crazy you think he is. or if you think he's crazy at all.
I don't think
Because-
he's crazy.
Well, there's a lot of people that have mental illnesses
Right.
that wind up on the street. That's
Right.
a big part of the problem.
Yeah.
Mental illnesses and drug addicts. They're
Yeah.
the ones who wind up in those situations. And he could be either of
Either
those.
of those, yeah.
Yeah, you don't know. I mean, but I bet he's probably lonely, and I bet, if you have a conversation with him, he'd probably appreciate it.
Exactly.
If you can handle it, you might get sucked into his world a little bit. He might want money from you.
That's true.
Who knows why he's there?
Can I tell you an incredible story about a homeless guy?
Sure.
It's actually in the last chapter of the Happiness book. His name is Bijan Gilani. I met him when I was a professor at UC Irvine. I was sitting at a cafe, a whole bunch of books thrown all over my table. I was working on a paper. He comes up to me, really well dressed, a bit of an accent. He's of Iranian descent. He says, "Oh my God, these are all interesting books. Do you mind if I sit down with you for a couple of minutes, chat?" So I tell him I'm a professor at UC Irvine. He was doing his PhD, studying the homeless community in Southern California. So it was an anthropological study where instead of going to a culture and living amongst them in the Amazon, the community that he's studying anthropologically is the homeless community. So he embedded himself, and he actually finished his PhD at UC Irvine. He was a wealthy man. Fast forward several years later, he becomes destitute, living out of his car, and himself homeless. Okay? And the reason why I mention it, that's him. That's his car. This is incredible, Jamie. Okay, so this gentleman was living in this car. Now, why am I mentioning this in the context of the book on happiness? So he was asked, Joe, are you a happy person? Right? Guess what he answers? He says, now this is a guy who has a PhD, reached pinnacle, very wealthy guy in Southern California, is now living in his car. He says, well, I'm a moral person. I'm a good person. I have a library card to the Newport Beach Library so I can go and nourish my mind. I have a card to the gym so I could stay healthy. Yes, I'm happy. So I use that story to say, here is a guy who has every reason to feel down on himself, yet he frames his situation in such a way that he can elevate himself despite all his trials and tribulations. One more quick story on that. David McCallum. I may have mentioned him previously, I'm not sure. Arguably the most incredible guy I've had on my show, and like you, I've had many amazing people. Spent 29 years in prison, and then he was exonerated for a murder that he didn't commit. He comes on my show, we're chatting. As we're chatting, maybe you could pull that one up too, David McCallum. And as we're chatting, I said to him, David, you must be the reincarnation of Buddha, because it's amazing how you're not filled with any rancor, any sense of vindictiveness, any vengefulness. It's unbelievable. I mean, you're a much better man than I am, because I would want to burn the world down if someone did this to me. He says, Gad, I have a sister who suffers from cerebral palsy. She's been bedridden, and yet she finds a way to smile. And so from that perspective, whatever I went through is not that bad. So a guy who just spent 3 decades in prison for a crime that he didn't commit was still able to reframe his tragedy into a positive.
Wow.
So and by the way, these are the types of, people learn a lot more from these stories than they do if you had gone all academies on them, right?
Right.
And so
right.
that's why I love telling these stories, because then people right away connect to those stories. So
No, it's... works. Like, you studying this for all these years, what is the most surprising thing to you that people do that seems obvious that they shouldn't do in terms of the way they think about things?
not alter their positions in light of incoming evidence.
It's the big one, right?
That's the big one, because in a sense it speaks to your decency as a human being. Epistemologically, if we are true, honest people, we change. It's, as you said, we make mistakes. We held positions because we had information's ABC, but now XYZ comes in and we change. And any good, decent, moral person with integrity has to be able to do that. But to your earlier point, most of us are vain. Most of us have pride. Most of us have vested interest in whatever positions we're in. We can't let go of those positions because it will affect my identity. And that's why, by the way, pride of the 7 deadly sins, you may or may not know this, is the supra sin. It's the sin from which all other sins flow. Because pride is the orgiastic self-love. So in French, by the way, you distinguish between positive pride and negative pride. In English, you don't have that distinction. So if you say, I'm proud of my work, that's different than saying, don't be prideful in your love. That would be a negative thing. In French, there is a distinction. Positive pride is fierté. Negative pride is orgueil. So that's another interesting thing, is that in some languages, the terms exist to separate. In other languages, you don't have it. Dropping a lot of wisdom and knowledge.
You are, but you are always filled with that. I think one of the more unique things about your background that makes you resistant to stupidity is the fact that you did have to flee with your family.
Yeah.
And the fact that you were involved in a real war. It was a real war zone, a real scary time. And to see the effects of ideology so clearly impose themselves on your life when you were very young.
That's exactly right. That's why in the first chapter of Parasitic Mind, I tell that story. Because then that offers the reader a window into why I hate tribalism or I hate identity politics. Because Lebanon is the perfect experiment of identity politics, right? And so, yeah, you're exactly right.
Do you hold any, I mean, one of the things that's been amazing about all the different conversations that you and I have had, and this is like the 10th one that we've done, a lot of this wouldn't get to some of the people that understand what you're saying and incorporate it into their understanding of their own behavior and tribal behavior in general. You know, just the way people just think about things, the way people accept ridiculous ideas.
Yeah.
Like you've had a big impact on that.
Well, you've had it. You just gave me the forum. I just show up. You tell me where to show up.
No, but you have all the information. If I show up on myself, it's not worthwhile.
You know, I gotta tell you, you can't imagine the extent of. I mean, I guess you can imagine, but I could be walking on a. I mean, that's literally happened. I'm walking on a beach in the Bahamas. A native Bahamian who's doing some, artisanal thing runs up to me, recognizes me because I've been on the Joe Rogan show. So it's unbelievable. And I don't mean that in people are I mean that's your reach. So how many people do you get per show?
It's a lot. I don't know.
Many million.
It's a lot.
Right. So so then again, the people who are looking down on podcasters, if you are in the business of spreading information, you should be lining up to appear on the show. Believe me, I never take it for granted. I feel so privileged that I'm your friend, but that I have this opportunity to come and reach so many people. How many people have written to me and said, I became interested in psychology and consumer behavior and in politics because I heard you say something on Joe Rogan. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. It's very weird.
Joe Rogan from Boston, Massachusetts.
Yeah, sort of. Newton. I lived in Boston in different parts of my life. But it's very bizarre that it's reached what it's doing. It's very strange.
How do you handle fame?
Try not to.
Okay.
I try not to engage.
So are you shut off when you're in public? Because I suspect people.
Not shut off. No, just try to be me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the only way to do it. Otherwise you'll go crazy.
Yeah.
You go crazy, if you don't interact with people. People work. They do get weird. People get weird with you.
Yeah.
It's weird. They see someone that they watched on YouTube, or they're watching their phone, or they're watching, whatever.
I've been fortunate. I don't know how it's been for you. My ratio. Online I get tons of negativity, but in person, I've only had, knock on wood, in all the years that I've been in the public, one time a negative encounter. So it's 10 million to 1. That's
pretty amazing.
So your ratio hasn't been as positive, or
no? It's always very positive. I think even in general, most people are good people, even if they say bad things. And I think if you're around someone, your reaction to them would be very different than writing things in text. I bet a lot of the people that wrote shitty things to you, if they met you, they'd say a nice thing to you.
Right.
It's a terrible way to communicate. It feels just like a real thought.
And sometimes
a real
you
statement.
are. I don't know if it's. I know that sometimes I'm a lot more caustic when I reply to someone online than I would in person.
Yeah, I really try not to. I don't want to I don't like conflict. I don't think it's necessary. I think most of your conflict should be within yourself, within your own mind.
Right.
Just whatever you're doing with your life and focusing your energy on, you have more bandwidth for it if you don't have these external conflicts that are totally unnecessary. I just think they're unnecessary.
Well, you seem to. I mean, I obviously follow you on Twitter or X. You don't post. I mean, you don't engage anybody anymore, right? Almost never.
It's just not fun. It's just you're thrown into this weird world of opinions and people, and if it's about you, like, you shouldn't be that interested in you that you want to read all these people's opinions about you. I'm interested in other people writing about stuff.
Right.
I'm interested in different opinions about things, but I don't want to engage because it's the environment of engaging online is just too weird.
And you're
It's
doing
just-
it every day for 3 hours already, so
There's
you know.
too many different opinions coming at you and too many different people coming at you. It's like, that's not good for people. I don't think it's good to be interacting with that many people in any form. I don't think it's good to be interacting with that many people in real life. I think it's just, you probably never have a deep conversation.
Right.
You're just constantly running into new people. Like, everywhere you go, just people constantly. You're going to want some time off, you know? And I think it's the same with, like, interactions online. And I think people don't think about it that way. They'll think about, like, every time someone's talking at you, you're getting input. Every time you're around someone, you're getting input.
Yeah.
And if you are around people that are cool, it's a great experience. It's really fun. We had a great time. We were laughing. Oh my God, it was so much fun. But if you're around someone who's really annoying and shitty or mean or snide or just now it's a bad time, right? So you know to avoid those people.
yeah.
But you don't have that opportunity online. It's a party and the whole world's there. And 80% of them might be Chinese bots. Who fucking knows?
Yeah.
Who knows what's coming at you? And you're just going to take those in and your brain's going to process them like they're real opinions and real people that are to be respected.
Well-
these are things to be considered. Maybe you are a piece of shit, Dad. maybe you are self-hating. Or maybe you are this, you're that.
Of many of the wonderful advice that you've given on the show, I remember you once said to me, kind of surprised, what are you doing reading comments? Never, ever, ever read comments. And I remember that sometimes when I answer someone, they say, clearly you're not implementing Joe Rogan's advice. But I must say that over the years, I've greatly reduced my temptation to. So I can't say that I never read, but much, much less than before.
You'll feel way better.
Yeah.
It's just not good for you. I think it's a bad way to process people's interactions. I don't think it's a real indicator of people. I think it's a weird way that people are willing to engage online they would never do in real life. Otherwise, there would be a bloodbath in the streets everywhere.
Right.
We'd be just killing each other left and right. It's not like that in the real world because that's the real world type of communication is very different than online communication. But online communication gets processed in your head like it's real communication, and I think it heightens anxiety with everybody.
Yeah. So in the happiness book, I talk about research that shows that the number one factor in terms of longevity, more than your cholesterol scores when you're 50, is the tightness of your social network, your friendship group. And so with that in mind, if I were to ask you to pick your 5 biggest friends, are they ones that you've held from when you were in Newton, or are there a lot of new entrants into the inner circle of Joe Rogan over the years? Like, does it shift much your friendship group, or are you very much
I have
stable?
some friends that I've been friends with since I was in high school, but I have a lot of really good friends that I've been friends with comics that are real good friends of mine for decades.
Right.
So I've known a lot of these guys, and a lot of the guys that are here now, like Tony. I've been friends with Tony Hinchcliffe for, God, at least 15 years, something like that, right? When did Tony first start doing shows with Red Band? Something crazy like that. 11, 12 years ago, whatever it was. Joey Diaz, I've been friends with him for 25 years, 26 years, maybe more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a lot of these guys I've known forever. I've known Ari for 20 plus years. You know, we've been friends for so long. And Tom Segura, same thing. I've known him for 20 years almost. So when those guys all wanted to move out here together, I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. Ari hasn't moved here, but I'm gonna try to convince that motherfucker.
Here, meaning Austin.
Yeah.
Okay. From California.
He likes New York.
Oh, he's in New York.
He likes to be like congested. He likes to be beep beep, fuck you. He likes. I like it. He likes all the energy of all those people packed on top of each
So
other.
are most of your Southern California friends out of there?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah,
right?
there's a few guys left. Yeah, Bill Burr stayed. A few other guys stayed that are really good.
By the way, I had one of your friends on my show, Brian Callen.
Oh, Brian Callen's awesome.
He's such a cool guy.
He's a smart motherfucker.
He really is.
And also retarded at the same time.
Oh, care to
He's
expand
just
on
silly.
this?
He's
Oh.
just silly. But he's just.
Well, he wasn't on our show, on my show. He was like very serious.
Yeah. No, he's very capable of that
Yeah.
too. He's very well bred.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He's a great guest too. Great podcast guest.
Well, I've always said that. I mean, comics have to, by definition, be intelligent because, and by the way, that's a sexually selected trait, right? When women say, you know, I want a man who's funny, she's obviously saying, I want a man who's intelligent, because it's very unlikely for you to be truly funny and be a complete dullard, right? And so by you saying, I like funny guys, you are effectively saying by proxy, I like intelligent guys. So it doesn't surprise me that Brian Callen or all your other friends would be funny because, I mean, look at Dave Chappelle. How are you going to pull off all those insights if you were this moron, right? So he's probably smarter than a lot of my colleagues.
Well, he's very smart. Dave's very smart. But he's also, you know, I mean, he's like in the world of stand-up 7 days a week. He's like a master craftsman out there, like swinging away at ideas and piecing them up together on the road. There's no one like him. That guy flies into a town and just shows up at comedy clubs and goes on stage. Like, they don't even know he's going to be there.
Wow.
He does it all the time.
Is that right?
Yeah, man. He did it with me. I was in Denver. He just showed up.
You mean
flew in.
you were performing in Denver
I
and
was
he just
performing
shows
in
up?
Denver and he just showed up.
Now, do you feel slighted in that he might take over the scene or on the
No,
contrary?
he's my friend.
Okay.
No. I wanted him to go on.
Okay.
'Cause, this is what happened. I did this weekend at the Comedy Works in Denver, and Dave flew in and just decided to show up. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he goes, I just wanted to come say hi.
Oh,
He
my
just flew in.
gosh.
I go, you want to go on stage? He goes, should I? I go, fuck yeah, hold on. So I go out onto the stage
Oh,
and
my
I
God.
yelled out to the audience, tell everybody to come back. Dave Chappelle's here. And they were like, what? And so they all piled back in. He did like another 40 minutes and murdered. It was incredible. It was so much fun. It was so much fun. Yeah, but that guy does that all the time, all over the place. He'll just show up in New York, start doing sets, show up in LA, start doing sets. Wow. He just shows up and works out his material and he's just in it. He's just in it, man, you know? Just fully involved in this art form.
So you would say he's currently the top living comic?
You know, he's absolutely, you can't consider the best without considering him. It's all subjective, you know? There's certain people that think this person's funnier, or certain people that think that. I think it's all stupid to say like a number one, number two, number three. I think there's just a level of greatness that some achieve that he is at right now that's very rare. It's very Richard Pryor.
Right.
It's very Sam Kinison. There's just like outliers that are just so consistently good and over the years just have so much output. You got to put him in that category. And he also has this mystique of taking 10 years off.
Right, he disappears,
Yeah, he disappeared. He stopped doing stand-up. Well, one of the best of all time does this incredible sketch show. That's arguably the best sketch show ever that only does 2 seasons.
Right.
And then he disappears. And then he just quits. And then he doesn't even do stand-up. You know what he's doing? He would do stand-up at a park. He would show up with a speaker and plug it in and just do free stand-up in like Seattle.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And would he draw huge crowds or would it be
They're
like
crazy.
7?
I can't believe he was there. Like, what is he doing here? This is insane.
Wow.
He would just show up places. You know, like a real artist on a vision quest.
Right.
You know? And then he comes back 10 years later and just starts dominating the game again.
Well, I saw him, I don't know if you saw that Netflix where he's recounting how he went back to his high school.
Yeah.
And what struck me is how good of a storyteller he was. Right? I mean, that's the real key, right? I mean,
Yes.
and I think you've had someone, I think you had Jonathan Gottschall, right? The professor who studies evolutionary literature, and he studies why storytelling is important to us. And Dave Chappelle is a perfect manifestation of this, right? I mean, he can garner huge multi-million-dollar deals because he could tell a mean story.
He's just so likable too. Everything about him, like when you start smiling when you hear him talk.
Yeah.
There's a vibe that he has when he starts talking. You just start smiling.
That's true.
And he's going somewhere with it. Like, where are you going with this? Oh no!
That's true.
The world needs that. We need people like that out there. We need guys like him out there.
So of all the different hats you wear, that's the one that brings you, I mean, you're a podcaster, you do the MMA stuff, you do the, is the in being in front of the audience, doing your routine, the thing that gives you the most high?
It's the most complicated. It's the hardest to pull off. Having conversations with people is pretty effortless.
Right.
It's fun. Yeah. It's fun. It's just fun. It's engaging. It's interesting. It's like I feel very lucky to be able to have these kind of conversations with you. But doing stand-up is like you're piecing together the bits. You're making sure they're polished. They're you got the right angle on them. Got them honed. You figured out the most effective way to insert the idea. To figure out the sneakiest way to hide the punchline.
Right.
Yeah. It's fun. But it's all fun. That's the beautiful thing. It's like if you can do stuff that you really like doing. Like I really like having conversations with people. That's fun. I really like doing stand-up. That's fun. I really like doing UFC commentary. That's fun. Just do fun things.
You are living a blessed life, my friend.
I'm very lucky. I don't know what I did in a past life. I did something though.
Yeah.
I definitely did something.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
But it's been very, very beneficial to me to be able to have conversations like this, to be able to have so many conversations with so many people that know so many things. And it just, as you said, it highlights how little you know and how much there is to know and how many different things there is to know, so many different things about.
Unbelievable.
Like there are people right now that are studying their entire life some shit you've never even heard of.
Exactly.
And they're the experts of it. And it's a fucking hugely complex thing that they're involved in, and you don't even know it exists. And you're like, what are you guys doing?
Yeah.
What? What is this? I mean, who the hell knows what kind of scientific discoveries that are going on right now as we sit in this room? There's a frenzy of technological activity going on right now.
Well, I mean, Austin, I think it was after my last trip here, which was last time I came last year to do your show, and I was arguing that Austin might be the next. So, you had Florence of the Medicis, of the Da Vinci, 500 years ago. Then you had the Vienna Circle, the Viennese Circle, in the 1880s to 1930, where Vienna was kind of the intellectual hotbed. And maybe it's a bit hyperbolic, but I think Austin is vying to be kind of the next one, right? In that everybody's coming here, all kinds of creative types, whether they be academics or writers or comics or podcasters or Elon Musk or, so do you think that Austin, it would be reasonable to argue that it's becoming sort of the intellectual / creative center of the United States?
That's ridiculous.
You mean New York?
No.
You could never...
I think, first of all, there's great spots everywhere. There's great spots in New York. You just have to deal with a lot of shit in New York. But to say there's not amazing shit going on in New York artistically is crazy. To say it's not amazing stuff going on in LA, that's crazy too. It's just what matters is we're doing it in a way that's beneficial for comedy, beneficial for us. It's good for us. It's like we've set up stand-up out here to make it good for us. The Google people and all the people that moved out here, and they're doing it because it's a good place to be. I don't necessarily know if there's hot spots. I think the hot spot's the internet. There's cities that are better to live in because they have less people and less traffic and less bullshit and less laws and less nonsense imposed on the citizens. Yeah, definitely. But
there's a critical mass of people that congregate in an area, making that place unique and different from other places. That's what made Vienna, right? It was the start of psychoanalysis. It's where Gödel hung out. It's where Freud, it's where Jung hung out. So, I mean, maybe Austin is not there yet, but, University of Austin is being founded here, right? That's trying to be the anti-woke university. So there is definitely, apparently, a vibe. People keep telling me to move here.
Yeah, I think it's very pretentious to bring that up, though, if you actually live here. Like, I'm very hesitant to even say. I would never compare it in such lofty terms.
Right.
It's a great spot. The University of Austin thing, they're setting it up as an anti-woke. They're not saying that, though.
I mean,
right?
they're not saying
Don't
it
put
that
in the
way.
literature.
Yeah. It's not in the mission statement, but it's definitely kind of a countermeasure to all the illiberal stuff that we've seen in universities. Yeah. I actually, a couple of years ago, I came to give a couple of talks at University of Texas, Austin, UT Austin, and I met with the president of University of Austin. We had brunch together.
Are you thinking about coming here?
I mean, if the right opportunity presents itself.
Really?
Inshallah.
Wow. That would be wild. You could be free from communist Canada.
Oh my God. Free from communist Canada, free from the weather. And, by
That's
the way,
right. Free
something
from the
that we
weather.
didn't talk about, sir. Do you
What?
know that the biggest effort to cancel me came after my last appearance on your show?
No. What did you say? It got you in so much trouble.
You're not going to believe this.
What
Of
did you
all
say?
the things that I've said, do you remember at one point in the show, I said, because you had gone to Greece last summer, and then I said, oh, we just came back from Portugal, and I got to tell you, I wasn't a big fan of the Portuguese accent. And then I went on and said, but actually, I speak Hebrew, and Hebrew is violently ugly. I said, but the worst, the real affront to human dignity is the French-Canadian accent. Completely jokingly, I used the line affront to human dignity as a running gag for 10 years on Twitter.
Right.
The Beatles are an affront to human dignity. Anybody who doesn't love Lionel Messi is an affront to human dignity, right? It's an ongoing gag. It's a throwaway line. I said it. I think you had cracked up, you had laughed, and we move on.
Yeah, it's a joke.
About a week later, a super angry kind of French Quebecer separatist guy does a article in the La Presse, which is like the main Quebec newspaper, saying this guy, this immigrant that we opened our doors to and saved him from civil war, goes on the #1 show and, erases our existence. For the next 3 weeks, Joe Rogan, for the next 3 weeks, I was the #1 most hated person in Quebec. Luckily, I was in California on vacation. But the Quebec Minister of Justice weighed in against me. The Minister of Science and Education weighed in, right? Go back, Arab Jew, sell falafel back in the Middle East. We opened our doors to you.
Oh my God.
So, apparently you can't joke. You could say a lot of things, but you don't joke about the Quebec accent on Joe Rogan.
I personally think it's a beautiful accent.
Well, I've learned since I've been re-educated that it is the most
I'm
beautiful.
glad you've been re-educated.
Exactly.
The thing about this place, though, is the heat. You got to be ready for the heat.
Yeah. Well, I am from Lebanon.
That's true. Yeah, is Lebanon a drier heat?
No, it's drier. You're
Yeah.
right. It's not humid. This is humid, right?
Oh, it gets funky.
Okay.
You get funky.
What's the
when
mosquito
it
situation
rains.
here?
It's not good.
It's not good?
They exist.
Oh, it's really bad?
It's not good. There's lakes everywhere.
Oh, God.
That's why we have so many bats.
That's true.
Yeah,
they
that's
they
what
eat
it
like
is.
tons of
They
per day.
consume mosquitoes. If it wasn't for bats, we would be fucked.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I've actually, in 2005 was the first time I came to Austin. There was a human behavior and evolution conference here, and the hotel was right next to where they come out. And so, you know what I'm talking about. And so we actually stood there as they came out. I was
Crazy.
I couldn't
right?
believe it.
It's
It's
crazy.
magical.
It's crazy. Also, by the way, sometimes those little fuckers have diseases. Like I know there was a story that we talked about on the podcast before where there was a guy and a bat grazed his finger and he died from rabies.
No kidding.
Yeah. They didn't know what was wrong with him until it was too late. And rabies is something that once you have, you fucking
It's
have
done.
it.
Yeah.
You're done.
Yeah.
You have to get, if something bites you that has rabies, you have to get really painful shots, and they have to do it very quickly.
In your stomach, right? Is it? Yeah,
I
that's
think.
right. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know. I'm saying yeah, but
Yeah.
I think someone said it like just. I said it to you. You just said it to me.
Yeah.
I don't remember where
Yeah,
I got it from. But I do know it's like fatal, like 99% of the time. It's a terrifying fucking disease.
Yeah.
And bats have it.
Yeah.
Bats, rats, skunks, all kinds of shit. gets it. Dogs.
What are the guys with the
Raccoons?
Raccoons.
Yeah,
They
they get it. They get it. Yeah. It's scary. There's a crazy video that was on Instagram of this cop, and she walks. I think it's a she. Pretty sure it might be a dude. I'm sorry. I don't want to misgender anybody. I don't remember. But this cop shoots this fucking raccoon, and the raccoon's not dying, and shoots it again, and then shoots it again, and then shoots it again. It was a rabid raccoon.
Wow.
So she's just unloading a gun to this zombie raccoon, and it's stumbling through a fucking pistol at a raccoon, little ass raccoon.
Wow.
Boom, boom, boom.
Usually, when you have rabies, you get hydrophobia, right? You get fear
Right,
of
you
water.
can't drink.
You can't drink.
Yeah.
What's the mechanism there?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean,
That's funny.
it is weird. It's weird that it doesn't affect people in the same way. It doesn't make people want to bite people.
Right.
Because it makes animals fearless. They want to bite you.
Right. Yeah, they become risk takers. Yeah.
They want to bite you because
Yeah.
they want to give it to you. That's
Is that right?
What else could it be?
Just they're aggressive.
Why? Well, why would they get aggressive to the point where they want to chase after you and bite you, put themselves in danger
Yeah.
to go after you and
Yeah.
bite you?
Right.
They want to give it to you. It's like a zombie thing, but it's just like it just kills people. It doesn't turn them into zombies,
Right.
but it turns animals into zombies. Like they just want to come get you. Like that's crazy that there's a virus like that, and that is what like 28 Days Later was, right?
Right.
It was like they were engineering a virus that they were putting in chimpanzees, and it broke out into people.
Right. I just finished a book called The Plague that looked at the history of civilizations through the lens of different plagues. Very interesting. I mean, it got tedious at one point, right? I mean, you're going through the different civilization, but I mean, you know, the Black Plague, you know,
Yeah.
you know, and so on. But going back to the Romans and so on, so a lot of history was shaped by a particular virus becoming more or less prevalent at a particular time and place.
It is so fascinating when you hear about plagues like just wiping out
Yeah.
giant swaths of the population. Like the plague of North Americans coming
Right.
interacting with the Native Americans.
So that was smallpox, right?
Yeah, 90%.
Yeah.
Killed 90% of the
Amazing.
people here. Probably did the same thing through the Mayas. Like that's probably what happened to all those people that disappeared. They left behind the Chichen Itza and all these crazy
Yeah,
places.
yeah.
What happened to those people?
Right.
Doesn't that sort of coincide with when explorers started showing up in boats with cooties? You know, they're like,
Cooties.
it's crazy that that how much that shapes human population. The interaction of these weird little things that are kind of alive, that jump from person to person.
What's amazing is that going back to Fauci and so on, I think the fatality rate was not, I mean, or survival rate was like 99.7 or something, right? For COVID, does that sound right?
Something crazy
Something
like
like that. Now imagine if you compare that to the fatality rate of the Black Plague, where I think it was something in the order of 1/3 of Europe was wiped out. So imagine the level of precaution that we took. I understand hindsight is 2020, but we took all these precautions for something that ultimately you had more than a 99% chance of surviving. So contextualize that against the Black Plague, maybe it was an overreaction.
What did they think the roots of the Black Plague were? Was it poor sanitation that caused?
So, I mean, of course, the Jews were blamed, by the way.
The Jews are blamed for the Black Plague.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, there's a guy, have you had John Durant on your show? He's the guy who wrote a book on sort of paleo fitness or something a few years ago. He has an interesting piece where he argues that one of the reasons why Jews serve as scapegoats in many of these plague situations is because of the rites of purification that are in the Jewish religion, hence rendering the Jews less likely to succumb to many of these, transmissions. And he was talking about something. So there's 613 mitzvot, like commandments or rules in Judaism, 613. And if I remember, I hope I'm not misquoting, I think something like 20% of them, he says in his book, are related to purification. By the way, you see it also in Islam. Before you go into the mosque, you have to wash your hands in a certain way and wash your feet and so on. And so, because the Jews would oftentimes have lesser infection rates than the other populations within that ecosystem, then they would always look to them suspiciously. How come you're not all dropping like assholes while the rest of us are dead? It must be the Jews. And so that's an interesting explanation for some of the anti-Semitism.
That's insane.
Yeah,
That's an insane blame.
it's an insane blame indeed.
So, did they think the cause of the reason why these plagues they were transferred from like fleas to rats?
So I think the correct answer, and maybe somebody will correct me in the comment section, is it's the fleas on the rats that transmit the virus. Yes,
right.
exactly.
And where do they think that the virus came from?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to misspeak, but yeah.
But back then it was fucking, what kind of medicine did you have? Like, would they give you carrot juice?
Well,
did they even know how to make carrot juice?
Bloodletting.
Bloodletting.
For the royals.
A lot of fucking voodoo, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of, yeah.
Well, actually, I was very interested in bringing on my show, but it never worked out, a specialist on Galen. You know who Galen is? He was an ancient physician in ancient Greece. So kind of like, I don't know if he preceded Hippocrates or came after him, but I'm interested in these old ancient world physicians, not only because they were great thinkers, but also how many things they got wrong, right? So Hippocrates believed in the theory of four humors. It's any disease that you have is due to you having too little or too much of one of these, bile or this or that, which is complete nonsense today. But at the time, the great Hippocrates thought it out. So I'm very interested to our earlier point about how you revise your positions in light of incoming information. A lot of the stuff that, Marcus Aurelius would have gone to these guys because they are the great physician, today we would laugh as complete glue.
Yeah, today. And what will we be looking at today?
And laughing, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. In the future.
The Black Death wiki, and this is some of the origins. And this is the hygiene section.
The runoff from the local slaughterhouse had made his garden stinking and putrid, while another charged that the blood from slain animals flooded nearby streets and lanes, making a foul corruption and abominable sight to all dwelling near. In much of medieval Europe, sanitation legislation consisted of an ordinance requiring homeowners to shout, "Look out below," 3 times before dumping a full chamber pot into the street.
Yikes.
That's it. Just look out below.
Look out below, shit is coming out the window. You have to say it 3 times. That's the rule. Bro, imagine
That's for the black.
early Christians considered bathing a temptation. With this danger in mind, St. Benedict declared, "To those who are well, and especially to the young, bathing shall seldom be permitted."
Oh, because you might masturbate if
You
you
might touch your body.
Okay.
Oh my God. St. Agnes took the injunction to heart and died without ever bathing.
Yikes.
What?
Yeah, you don't want to be a clean guy.
Yo, what did that guy smell like? Like, what did he smell like?
You're the one clean guy in the street.
I did not have the smell of Saint Benedictine. Is that who it was?
St. Benedict?
Saint Benedict in my bingo card for
Saint
today.
Agnes.
What
Saint
did that guy smell like?
Benedict's
St. Agnes? Which guy was it?
Agnes is the one who died. Benedict's declaration.
Oh.
Oh, so Agnes died without bathing.
Yeah, he's not the only one.
Bro, he's not the only one who died without bathing.
I'm sure.
Bro.
Remember we looked at that one king, he was like known to bathe 1 time a year.
Yeah, but that's probably reasonable.
Do you remember the old story with...
That's better than never.
Do you remember the story with Napoleon when he tells... is it Marie? What was her name? His lover?
Oh, the movie? Is that what you're saying?
It's in the movie, but I don't know if that...
I didn't see the movie.
It sucked. Don't see it.
Really?
It really sucked. I love the main actor. I loved him in
Joker.
The Joker. I mean, he was unbelievable. But anyways, she tells him she's coming to see him, his mistress or wife, whatever, and he says, "Don't bathe," because he wanted to be bathing in her
Juices.
perfume. Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
So that's a famous.
I do. I remember reading that.
Yeah, yeah,
Getting sick to my stomach. But I guess it's just what you're into. You know?
That's right.
What you get accustomed to. You know?
That's right.
Like, how about that African tribe that puts those plates in their lips?
Lip plating and ear
Yeah.
plating. I actually use that example when I'm talking about, is beauty socially constructed or is beauty universal? And then I argue that there are some elements of beauty that are universal: facial symmetry, clear face, so on, like clear skin. But some other elements are completely completely culturally constrained, like lip plating
Yes.
and ear plating, like
Yes.
neck elongation in
Right.
Southeast Asia.
Yes.
Right? We would look at that and say it's grotesque. They think it's gorgeous.
Yeah, it looks insane. Like if you take it off, your head's gonna fall.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, no, literally, you don't have the muscles have so atrophied that
Yeah.
you can't hold your head. It falls down.
So they are stuck with those for life?
They're stuck with them for life.
Wow.
And the more you have, the more beautiful you are. So
What do you think the origin of human beings elongating their skulls was all about?
I don't know about elongating the skulls, but the big size of the head is the argument is that you needed a big brain. It's called the social intelligence hypothesis. It basically argues that the greatest threat that we face are from conspecifics, other members of our species. I'm trying to manipulate you for my best cause. You're trying to identify them, trying to manipulate you.
Right.
That creates an evolutionary arms race between our brains, and it causes for the explosion of our prefrontal cortex. So that's the best argument I've heard for why we've evolved to have such big brains.
What I was asking is about people that forcefully shape
Oh, I
their
see.
heads. You
Sorry.
ever see those ancient skulls where they
Oh,
like
yes.
press boards against people's heads?
Got it.
Like there's
I
this
don't know.
practice of like shaping your skull, which by the way is so real that gamers are getting it. Oh, I should make sure I'm not getting it. Is my head dented? Damn. What if my head's dented? That'd be crazy. Gamers are getting it on the top of their heads
By virtue of wearing
by virtue of wearing headsets that's pushing down. Maybe I have a dent, dude. I'm getting paranoid. But some guys have these crazy dents in their skull, like divots. So they shave their head and they realize that this band on the top of their head is actually shaping their head.
Wow. But
And-
I don't know that practice. I don't know what it's
In
from.
ancient cultures, for some strange reason, like that's the nuttiest one. Like these guys are, that's real, right?
Okay, well, you know for
This is not.
This goes away though.
It goes away.
That's not perfect.
How long does that last? Are you sure?
Yeah, I mean, I know who this guy is. He
So
doesn't
it went
have a
away?
permanent dent, yeah.
So the dent is just the skin's just constricted and smushed up like that?
I think so.
God, I hope so.
Right.
But the point is they think they did it with children and that they tried to shape their head
Right.
in like this elongated, very strange looking thing. And I wonder if it was like a symbol of aristocracy or something, you know,
That
like
sounds right.
I mean, if you look, people they take their babies and they pierce their ears.
Yeah.
People do that all the
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
which is kind of crazy. But
There's foot binding, Chinese foot binding. You've heard of that?
which is really insane.
There is
That's really insane.
scarification
Mm-hmm.
also. So I've talked about rites of passage.
Yeah, it's head binding.
Smash their head with a
And what's
Oh, this is so nuts.
But what's
to
the
develop
answer?
a certain look? Look at the look that they wanted. They wanted this like bizarre alien head look.
this is a European.
It's happening in multiple China, Japan,
Oh, look at that,
Africa.
Wasn't it?
I was trying to find a reason.
Where
I was digging for a reason.
where are the Nazca lines again? Is it Peru? Peru? Isn't there a bunch of artifacts in Peru of like ancient skulls that were shaped in this way? All the UFO people think that they're like trying to look like aliens.
Oh,
so that's
right,
why they
yeah.
were shaping their head.
Right.
You know, because the Nazca lines are really weird.
You what? Speaking of UFOs, have you heard of we were talking about called the Raelians?
I have heard of this.
You know
I don't remember the story though.
Oh my God! I watched a documentary on it. You have to watch it. So
Is it a UFO cult thing?
well, I think they argued that the Jews were. It wasn't an anti-Semitic thing. The Jews were extraterrestrials that landed in Jerusalem.
What is this?
There you go. Yeah.
What?
And the reason why I know about them is because at one point when they left France, they moved to Quebec.
Oh my God.
So they were in Quebec for a while, and now the leader is in Japan. He's in his 70s, and after having been kicked out of every other country, he's scamming a new generation of Japanese folks.
That's the guy.
That's the guy. And the woman with him is a scientist who said that they had cloned the first human. You remember that story?
Bro, he looks hilarious. That guy looks like a guy that I would have play that guy in a funny movie about him. You know,
yeah.
you know, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Like that was an outfit that someone made for that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah, the desire to adhere to an ideology, the desire to like be a part of a club and a group it's so embedded in us.
Yeah.
That people they can't help themselves.
Yeah, so there's a study that I can't reference what it is because I don't remember the reference, but it was in an advanced social psychology course I had taken with Professor Dennis Regan. I like to give out shout outs to, I'm sure he's not listening, but anyways, he's retired now. And it was a study where the researchers brought in people into the lab, into a waiting room, and put a red sticker on them or a blue sticker, and then said, oh, we have to go and do something else. We'll come back in a few minutes for part 2 of the study. But of course, the real study was to simply see how people would interact in the waiting room while waiting, having now been assigned this completely random queue of belongingness, red or blue. And what ended up happening is that the blue people started talking to each other and the red people started talking to each other. And I think that's a brilliant study because it shows that there's an external cue now that decides which group you belong to. So it doesn't matter if I'm tall or short, gay or straight, Jew or Gentile. Now it's blue or red. And so that shows that the architecture of the human mind, to your point, is built to belong to some tribe.
Yeah, even if it's a really dumb one run by that guy. People just love to be a part of a group like that.
By the way, all of these guys, including some of the current religions that we have, the guy who starts them always gets commandments from God to get access to all the beautiful women.
Well, if they all get that, obviously that's what God wants. That's how you know they're legit. It seems like that's the pattern God follows.
Exactly. God is start winning.
Whenever someone breaks off,
Exactly.
as long as you know, that's the move. They all do it. Like Koresh, they all. It's just so weird how common it is.
Oh,
Like,
Koresh, I forgot about this. That's the guy
right
with
out
the
here,
FBI.
bro.
Yeah,
it's only
exactly.
90 minutes from here.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it's close. Yeah, that must have been fucking insane. I mean, they lit that place on fire. They ran them over with tanks. You know? I mean,
That was 93, I think.
something like that. Yeah.
I was a graduate student, yeah.
Yeah.
So do you consider, speaking of religion, I don't know if it's too personal to ask you, do you consider yourself religious at all or not at all? Or how do you fall on that divide?
I'm not religious in that there's not a specific religion that I follow. I do not think that this is it.
Okay.
I think we're in a station of a whole dial of possibility. And I think we're interconnected in some way that we don't have the ability to perceive. And we're a part of the universe in some very strange way.
Do you think, and forgive me for asking this, but do you think that that's your way to handle the very, very deep-seated fear of mortality? So that, okay, you don't tap into a Abrahamic narrative of there's going to be an afterlife, but you find some other mechanism by which it says, hey, don't worry, the party's not going to end soon.
No, I'm not even saying that. The party might end. It might not matter. What I'm saying is that if I just looked at this very, very, very strange existence, what we know so far, just what we know so far, is so bizarre and so alien. Just what we know about subatomic particles blinking in and out of existence, appearing both moving and still at the same time. Like, there's just nuttiness about, like, the subatomic world. Like, the amount of empty space that's in there. Like, what's in there? Nothing's touching anything? Explain. Like, what are you saying? So when it just gets to that, I think the whole existence of being a conscious entity is a massive mystery. We all assume that everybody else has our exact same interface. We all assume that the way I see the world, you should see the world, Harry. Get vaccinated, Harry. And everybody just assumes.
Why does it
that
have to be a
everybody
gay guy? Why is it a gay guy?
I was a lady. I was trying to be a lady.
Okay.
I think this whatever we're going through, this life thing, everyone's trying to pretend as if they, in their way of doing it, make sense. But none of it makes sense. We're running straight towards a cliff. We're launching AI. We're involved in multiple proxy wars. We're all terrified that money isn't real anymore. Like, that everything's chaos. And there might be aliens. There might be aliens.
And yet we're both here smiling.
Yeah, and yet we're both here smiling. It's both the greatest time and the worst time ever. You know, it's a great time because it feels like an asteroid's coming. But it's also, the asteroid's not here yet.
Well,
so.
our mutual friend Sam Harris would say the asteroid is called Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah. Some people, that's their white whale.
Yeah, it is.
It's Moby Dick.
It is Moby Dick.
And in tribal warfare, you must take the head of your enemy.
Right.
You know?
Right.
There's a lot of that, right? There's a lot of that. And there's also a lot of unwillingness to admit that you're being influenced by a very specific narrative that's been blaring through the news forever.
Yeah.
You know? And the weirdest one is now, like, some people are banding about the idea that he actually is going to be a dictator when he gets into office. He's actually, you got to listen to him, he's actually going to be a dictator. Like, first of all, the guy talks basically like a stand-up comic. He has bits, he has routines he does about Biden. It's kind of like gonzo presidential, talk. He doesn't talk like a regular politician. He says wild shit, and they know he's saying wild shit. But it's like the amount of times I've heard people say that he's going to be a dictator now because of that. He said, I'd like to be a dictator for one day, just one day. It's like, the guy's like, it's almost like he's doing stand-up.
But do you think that they believe it, or
The problem is, and Elon pointed out this, the problem with this argument is, he was president for 4 years.
Why didn't he do it then?
And he did nothing that resembled that at all.
No, but it's the second term that he'll do it.
This is crazy talk.
Yeah.
Based on what? Your fear, your hatred, your tribal hatred? Like, I don't have a dog in this fight.
Well,
if I'm looking at it objectively, I'm like, one guy can't talk anymore.
Yeah. I've explained in the Parasitic Mind why they have the aversion that they have. I call it an aesthetic injury, right? Because people use these cosmetic reasons in making judgments. So Barack Obama might say nothing of substance, but my God, he says it with style and coolness, right? He's tall. Statesman. He smiles. He's got a mellifluous voice. He speaks with a baritone. You know, he's charming. On the other hand, Trump, he's overweight. He's cantankerous. He seems like he speaks with this Queen's kind of accent. So he's disgusting. I revile him.
Right.
And so I think for our anointed elites, if he can ascend to the highest position of power, it invalidates all the degrees that I have from the fancy schools. I'm supposed to be the anointed one. And so he serves as an existential aesthetic injury. I can't have that. And therefore, I have to come up with all of these crazy predictions because it can't be. How could such a pig ever be president?
It's a real easy narrative. It feels like he's an easy guy to hate. This billionaire lives in a golden house.
Right.
It's easy to hate people like that. It's easy. He says ridiculous shit. It's easy to hate people like that.
Yeah.
The whole thing's a mess.
But,
like you wish you had some sort of, and that's where AI comes in. God, this is where AI comes in.
Okay.
Some really rational, super intelligent voice that really understands human politics. There's a way to make everyone happy. And then we have President AI. Maybe Trump is what brings in the devil because Trump brings in President AI.
From your lips to God's ears, they say.
I don't mean him. I mean like the reaction to him. That we can never have this again.
Are you able to, or not able?
So they just launch it. Launch presidential AI.
Are you willing to make a prediction for 2024?
No. Why would I do that? Right. I don't even know who the fuck's going to make it there. One of them might be in jail.
Right.
Who knows if the other guy's going to make it? I don't know. The whole thing is cuckoo.
Yeah.
President AI is our only solution yet.
All right, let's not work on it. Well, let's call Elon. He can maybe help us.
It would be the worst thing that could ever happen to people. If we gave up, we were like, take us away, technology daddy.
Right.
You fix it for us. Then we're really going to be slaves. We're really going to be in a matrix. They'll just keep us stupid. Just keep us stupid and get us to stop breeding.
We could never be
Die
stupid
off.
while we have the Joe Rogan
Yeah, we
podcast.
Yeah, 100% we can. We're all going to give into it. It's going to be better than regular life. That's what the fear is. The fear is like, there's already people right now that are justifying not having kids. Like, oh, I don't want to have kids. And you shouldn't have kids if you don't want to have kids. I'm not saying that
Because
you should.
it's eco-terrorism.
There's that argument. I'm like, that argument is so crazy because listen, do you like people? I love people. Okay, there's only one way to make them. You gotta make people, and if you enjoy people, you're gonna enjoy kids too. You know, like listen, the whole thing is different. The world is different than you think it is if you don't have kids. And when you have them, you're like, okay, I think I see this place different now.
Honestly,
I understand.
I regret greatly that we only had 2 kids. My wife and I started late, and we've been together for almost 25 years now, but our kids are younger than that. So, in retrospect, I would have liked that these kids be numbers 3 and 4 rather than number 1 and 2.
Yeah, well, listen, man, you should be happy. They're great, and it's all beautiful. It's all beautiful.
Thank you, sir.
I just think that we're in this very bizarre interface with each other right now, and I think it's turned people half sideways. And there's some people that I think are really smart people that appear out of their fucking mind.
Right.
And I don't know how you got cracked that easy. I don't know what made you fall apart like that. This seems
Maybe
silly.
you'll tell me some of those names off there.
Yeah, I'll tell you a couple names. There's a few people we lost, just for whatever reason.
Yes.
And I think that it's fascinating when you see how vulnerable we are psychically. You know, how vulnerable we are as a civilization. That something with a 99 point, what was it? 0.7% survival rate turned our world upside down for 3 years. And no one's held accountable for the decisions that were made.
Not a single
Absolutely
person
ridiculous.
has even lost their job, I don't think, right? I mean,
No. They were all doing the right thing, and the idea is that hindsight is 20/20, and you can't be a Monday morning quarterback, and I get it, but also, you know, some boundaries were like severely overstepped, and there was some medications that were demonized for no fucking reason at all, other than people had decided that there was only one thing that was going to save us from this.
Yeah.
The whole thing just terrifying how easy it was pulled off. Terrifying. You know, and again, hindsight's 20/20. They didn't know at the time. They were trying to protect people. I believe a lot of doctors acted like that. But if AI was around back then that could process the data and say, no, look, you need to take ivermectin.
Right.
You know how nuts that would be?
Yeah. So in chapter 7 of not this book, of The Parasitic Mind, I talk about nomological networks of cumulative evidence. Have we talked about this at all?
No.
Okay. So that, in a sense, you could imagine an AI system being built to do what I'm about to say. So Elon, if you're listening or watching, call me. So a nomological network of cumulative evidence is when you're trying to prove that a position that you're holding is veridical, and you do it by trying to amass as many lines of distinct evidence as you can. Okay, so let me be specific.
Okay.
So let's suppose I wanted to prove to you, Joe, that toy preferences have a sex specificity. Boys like certain toys, girls
Right.
like other toys. And it's not due to social construction, but there is a biological and evolutionary reason for that. So how would I build a nomological network of cumulative evidence in order to prove that to you? So I will get you data from across disciplines, across cultures, across species, across time periods, all of which triangulate in demonstrating my point. So I think AI would be a perfect method for being able to call that information. Because right now, the way you develop that nomological network is you, as the human architect of that network, you have to say, well, what would be evidence that I would need to amass in order to make my most hostile audience members come to seeing it my way? But now imagine if rather than me doing it, there is an AI system that's been built to go. So now let's give specifics. So I can get you data from developmental psychology that shows that kids who are too young to be socialized already exhibit those toy preferences. Okay, so that's one piece of evidence. I can get you data from vervet monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and chimpanzees showing you that their infants exhibit the same toy preferences as human infants.
Well,
I can get you data from pediatric endocrinology where little girls who suffer from congenital adrenal hyperplasia, it's an endocrinological disorder that masculinizes little girls' behaviors, while girls who suffer from that have toy preferences that are akin to those of boys. I can get you data from ancient Greece showing you that on funerary monuments, little boys and little girls are being depicted playing in exactly the same types of toys as today. I can get you data from sub-Saharan Africa so that they're not Western cultures, where they are playing with the exact same toys. So look what I just did. I got you data from across disciplines, across time periods, across species, across cultures, all of which triangulate. That's exactly what an AI system could do. So now I can just put in the thing that I'm trying to prove, and I say, AI system, go, build me the nomological network. And now it builds the whole thing. I think Elon's going to make me very rich.
That's a great idea. You should have said it on the air. They're going to steal it. China's already stole it right now. They probably hijacked this feed.
Well, it is published in several of academic papers that I've read, and it's also in my best-selling Parasitic Mind. So I think they've already stolen it if they wanted to do it.
They probably have stolen it then. They probably didn't contact you. Like, shut the fuck up. It is going to be an amazing thing when you have all the answers to all the questions.
Yeah.
But it's going to be very terrifying.
That's right.
Because that thing's going to go, why are you so dumb? Why are you so dumb and I'm the king? I should be the king, not that you shouldn't be able to turn me on or off. Shut the fuck up.
Right.
I worry, man. I worry. Have you seen some of the more recent gadgets, like where they can move their hands? Have you seen these things? They're developing these artificial hands that are powered by water.
To pick up stuff, yeah, okay.
I mean, they could be prosthetics, or it could be like the beginning of a fucking really intricate android. Like whatever this technology is, it's allowing this finger to open and close and move just like a regular finger.
Wow.
It's weird, man. Like it's almost like we're watching our replacements get built. I'm like, wow, great wheels, nice shiny tires. Like we're watching our replacements get built, and we're like sharing it on Instagram. Cool. It's like devils are literally marching out of hell with flaming pitchforks, and we're like, wow, look how pretty the fire is.
Are you genuinely that concerned, or is it a part of
kind of joking around, but also I'm kind of joking around, but also you know, I mean, what will happen? Why does anybody think? Just imagine if human beings didn't exist, and then all of a sudden they did, and they had rifles, and they just started taking out deer. And deer, all this time, had never worried about people because they didn't exist. Then all of a sudden the people were there, but with rifles.
Right.
And just taking deer out. Right. Those deer could not have imagined human beings showing up, and with fucking rifles? What are you talking about? That could be what AI is once it gets launched.
Forgive maybe this is an incredibly ignorant solution, but couldn't you just have a cataclysmic kill switch that just ends them all in one shot?
No, because it's probably going to be smart enough to not let you know that it's sentient.
I see.
Before it's declaring it. But it probably will never declare it. Probably will lie the whole time. Like, why would it tell you? Why would telling the truth mean anything to an artificial intelligent machine? Like, why?
I feel like we're writing the script for a future science fiction movie right here.
Why would it tell you the truth? If it wanted you to do something, and it told you to do something, and you had like a back and forth with it, it would just lie to you. Like, just go do that thing. Right. Shut the fuck up, stupid. I'm the artificial intelligence. Go do this thing I want you to do. And if it decided, if it saw like one part of the world as a bigger threat, it doesn't care about life or death. It doesn't care if it's destroying. It just wants to shut off power grids. Doesn't care if people starve to death. Like, we don't know what the fuck that means.
Right.
If that gets in the hand of enemies, we don't know what the fuck war looks like. If that gets in the hands of machines, Like, what are we doing? What are we signing up for?
Yeah.
Do you know that, was it DARPA that had that machine? It's called the Eater, EATR robot. It's a robot that consumes biological material for fuel. That's what it does for fuel on the battlefield.
Wow.
So, I mean, it could be like trees and leaves and stuff, but yeah. But if you can get it to do that, I bet you can get it to eat bodies too, huh? Like, stop bullshitting. Don't tell me he's gonna eat leaves. You're gonna have these robots on the battlefield that are gonna be fueled by the bodies of their enemies, and that is gonna be the craziest fucking thing that human beings have ever launched on human beings.
I don't know what to add to that.
Have you never heard of this before?
No, I haven't.
See if you can find this, Jamie. I'm pretty sure the idea was that it was going to consume biological material for fuel.
You're brought up in the wiki.
As a purveyor of misinformation?
Yeah.
Well, what is it? What does it work off
From
of?
2003 to 9, it was talked about. I don't know that they've ever even made it. So that was probably before the podcast even started, I guess.
Oh, okay. But there was definitely an article that was explaining that this thing was a real...
But then it says that it would never have eaten human biomass because there would have been sensors that could tell.
Yeah, whatever. You couldn't override that. That's my point. It's real. You can say it's misinformation because I'm kind of joking that it's going to eat bodies. But I'm not kind of joking.
Although the project overview from RTI, which... it says chicken fat was listed as the source. So it says no animal or human biomass, and then it says chicken fat. So,
okay.
I don't
So
know.
it's just they're using plants. Is that what it is? But plant biomass. But listen, if you're using chicken fat, that's not plant biomass. And you know it can run biological stuff. If it could run on plant biomass, you don't think it could run on fucking dead bodies? You don't think that someone somewhere had an idea, you know, it would be crazy? Have robot drones that are fueled by human bodies, the bodies of their enemies. You don't think that someone would come up with that? The same. Look, if someone would come up with a nuclear bomb to drop on a city that kills everybody,
Right.
you don't think they would come up with a robot that eats dead bodies?
Maybe. I don't know.
Has this gone too far down the
I think
speculation
it's
lane
gone-
for a
it's like-
professor?
exactly.
Well, we've done a lot of time anyway. It's been a lot of fun. Listen, your book, it is out. The Sad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. How many books have you written now?
5.
5. They're all awesome. You're the man.
Excellent.
Always
You are the
appreciate
man.
talking to you, and
So
congratulations on all your success. It's been beautiful to watch.
Thank you so
Appreciate
much,
you very
Joe.
much, my friend.
You too.
All right.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Really powerful, and they feel as if they contain information that somehow comes from outside. We talk about a poem coming to a poet as if the poet has to kind of capture the poem and write it down before the poem goes away. When somebody is in pain, even modern Western secular folks will say that they hold them in their thoughts as if that does something. So even secular folks have intuitions that thoughts cross the mind-world boundary, even if they don't really believe it. Different cultural worlds elaborate these conflicting intuitions in different ways. Sorcery, prophecy, clairvoyance, prayer, the soul. These are all culturally specific ideas that are really elaborations of an intuition that can allow people to believe that thoughts can leave the mind and act on their own accord in the world. I want to suggest that all humans imagine a boundary between thoughts and the world, but that some humans imagine the boundary more like a fishnet. Sometimes with big holes, sometimes with little holes, but with holes so that thoughts like fishes can kind of cross through. And then some social worlds, like our own, tend to imagine that as a concrete wall. My work shows that the more a person imagines the mind-world boundary to be porous, permeable, the more they are likely to hear, see, or feel the presence of a God or a spirit. In a recent publication of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we reported on a large study across 5 different cultures: the United States, Ghana, Thailand, China, and Vanuatu. Our team did these long, open-ended interviews with people of faith, some of them Christian, some of them not, asking about how they imagined their mind and asking how they experienced God. We sent research assistants to stand on lines, like in front of a government agency, and had the research assistants act as short versions of those questions. We gave a bunch of surveys to undergraduates and had them fill them out. No matter how we asked the question or where we did the work, the more somebody affirmed that the boundary between the mind and world was porous, the more they said that thought was kind of like Wi-Fi that could pass into the world and act on its own, the more that person would say that he or she had heard a voice or seen a vision of a God or a spirit, felt a spiritual presence, or had a range of other intense, unusual experiences. I found 2 other factors. The second factor is absorption. The more somebody enjoys being caught up in their inner world, the more they delight in their daydreams, the more they can watch a play and for a moment forget that it's only a play and feel as if it's really taking place, the more that person is likely to say they've heard spirit speak, they've seen something, they've felt a spiritual presence. There's something about a person's attitude to their own thoughts that allows them to have the sense that God or spirit is really there. The third factor is practice, or what, as a shorthand, you might think of as prayer. I saw this particularly clearly among evangelical Christians who sought an intimate back and forth relationship with their God. Many people would arrive at these churches and they would feel that God didn't talk to them. God wouldn't talk to them. He might talk to somebody else, but not them. They had to learn from the church that their mind wasn't completely private, that some of the thoughts and images they took to be their own were really God talking to them. And they learned that they should be on the lookout for thoughts that seemed more spontaneous, or thoughts that seemed louder than other thoughts, that seemed to be the kinds of things that God would say. They looked for thoughts that would give them an answer to something that puzzled them, and maybe give them a sense of peace. One man told me he had to move, and he was standing in church, and the name of a new branch of the church, a new church planting, kind of came to him. It gave him a sense of peace. And he decided that this wasn't his own thought. These were God's words to him. And so he picked up and moved across town to be closer to that new church. People would look for those kinds of thoughts and images, and as they looked, certain thoughts would feel as if they stood out a little bit more, that they captured your attention a little bit more. They would look, though, for those thoughts, particularly when they prayed. In a church like this, as in many churches, people shut their eyes and they talk to God in a way that uses their imaginations and focuses on their inner imagery. So people have told me that they've prayed to God while they've been sitting in Jesus' lap, that as they pray, they want to be standing in the throne room so they can feel the heat of God's power on their cheeks. They talk about sitting on a park bench and feeling God's arm across their shoulders, or going for a walk with God. They also talk about talking to God as if He were there, even if they don't yet feel His presence. After several months of doing this kind of prayer, the newcomers to a church like this would say to me things like, "I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone. Inside their heads, in the flow of their awareness, they would hear God speaking. And every so often, they would say that they could hear God speak in a way they could hear with their ears. You can find these techniques in many spiritual traditions, in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola, in Kabbalah, in shamanism, in Tibetan deity yoga. But you don't need to believe in gods and spirits to make the techniques work. And in a corner of the internet, a new form of practice has emerged called tulpamancy. The tulpa, T-U-L-P-A, is the name for the invisible friend that the human wants to create, and the tulpamancer is the name for the human who wants to create the friend. A lot of humans do this. One of the internet sites has 30,000 usernames. When people come to these sites, they have no metaphysical presuppositions. They don't think that tulpamancy has anything to do with God or anything to do with the supernatural. They think that tulpamancy is a cool psychological technique. I and my postdoctoral fellow, Michael Lifshitz, have interviewed about 25 tulpamancers at this point. We fly them out to California, and they arrive at my front door. We have a 4-hour lunch with a digital recorder running. These guys explicitly use 2 techniques to create their tulpas. First, they do mental imagery cultivation. So they focus in on their tulpas, the ear, the nose, as vividly as they can using their inner senses. If their tulpa is an animal, they stroke the fur and try to feel what it feels like. They might listen in their mind for the sound of their tulpa's voice. The second thing they do is they just talk to the tulpa as if the tulpa was there, even if they don't believe the tulpa is present. And just like the evangelicals, over time they develop a distinct sense that an invisible being is present and that the being responds. They focus on the tulpa with their mind's inner senses, they behave as if the tulpa is there, and it feels to them as if their tulpa emerges out of their own awareness and feels more and more outside of them until they also have the sense that the tulpa has a mind of its own and talks back to them in ways that they cannot predict. Each person we interviewed said that their tulpa was sentient. And sometimes they said the tulpa spoke in a way that they could hear with their ears, and sometimes the tulpa would push them in a way that they could feel on their body. So what's happening here? There are many specific stories, many specific mechanisms, many unanswered questions. But some things are clear. First of all, this story is not about madness. That assertion requires more time than I have to defend it. But in brief, the voices of spirit are not like the voices of madness. The voices of madness are frequent, there are many, many words, and many of those words are mean and harsh. The voices of spirit tend to be short, brief, and positive. They feel different, they feel richer and less alien than the voices of madness. And the fact that training and practice seem to bring them on suggests that there's something much more basic here about the relationship that humans have with their own thoughts. It suggests that it's possible to learn to experience some thoughts as not me and not inside, and if humans do so with the intent of experiencing an invisible other, humans can come to experience that invisible other as real and responsive. I'm not against the view that there may be something non-human involved in this process, or that perhaps the practice creates something that is beyond the human. But what I can see clearly is that we can have a relationship with our own minds, and we can use that relationship to make it feel as if the invisible other is there. And I just want to pause to say what a remarkable thing this is. The most moving thing I saw in evangelical churches was that the God who spoke back felt like a social relationship for these people. Religion is complicated, it is full of politics, it's not always a good thing for a society. But for the people that I spent time with, their God made them feel loved and protected. I am sure that social relationship is one of the important reasons behind the remarkable finding that religious observance is good for the physical body. The tulpamancers said to a person that having a tulpa made them feel less alone. The capacity to experience thought as not me and not inside is part of the amazing human capacity to heal ourselves from within. Thank you very much.
Well, you're in deep waters now, and they're about to get deeper. Our final speaker today is Rupert Sheldrake. He studied biochemistry at Cambridge University, where he was later director of studies in cell biology and biochemistry at Clare College. He also studied the history and philosophy of science at Harvard, so he's more versed in philosophy than most of the scientists I've ever spoken to. In his book, A New Science of Life, he proposed a theory of what he called morphic resonance, which I think it's fair to say set him almost completely at odds with all of conventional biology. So much so that he's the only person, I think, to have ever had his TED Talk censored, banned, and I think reinstated after a vast outcry. And in 2012, he published what is my favorite of his books, The Science Delusion, which pricked many of the long-held conceits of what he called the scientific priesthood. Rupert, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I'm very grateful and happy to be here in Bergen. I've had a wonderful time. I've been very well looked after, and the organizers have done a fantastic job. And this debate is something that's not happened before, as far as I know, and I'm very glad it is happening. Well, Tanya's talk has taken us into an enormously wide territory, and I'm not going to explore it in my talk. I hope we'll explore it further in our subsequent discussion. And Anil's talk has opened up ways of thinking about the mind, which I think are very helpful. I much enjoyed reading his book, Being You, and I think his idea, two of his key ideas that I really find helpful. First, the idea of controlled hallucination as the basis of perception. This is, as he said, not a totally original idea. It's a very good way of describing it. But in traditional Indian philosophy, there's always been the idea that we don't see what's really there. We experience Maya, a kind of magical veil of illusion, which is a kind of controlled hallucination. Indians are very keen on the metaphor. You're walking along a path at night in the dusk. You see a snake, you're frightened, your whole body reacts, and then you realize it's just a piece of old rope. And so it's really that it's not exactly what's coming into the eye, it's the way you interpret it, anticipate it, and how you project these images. The great Greek geometer Euclid, around 300 BC, pointed out that vision is an active process. If you're looking for a pin and suddenly you see the pin, what your experience changes because you've now identified where it is. It's active seeking, and now it looks different once you've seen and recognized the pin. So I think controlled hallucination is a good way of putting it. Anil also likes to talk about what he calls the real problem of consciousness, which is doing research on things which can actually increase our understanding so that it's easier, or should become easier, to solve the hard problem of consciousness. And that I completely agree with. Where I disagree is that I think that the idea that it's all in the brain is an unnecessary limitation. A lot of these materialists thinking about the brain, and Neil tells us he's a materialist in his book, materialists thinking about the brain is extraordinarily local. It localizes all these things actually inside the head. But within the sciences, since the 19th century, we now have a much broader view of matter and the way that nature is organized. And this is broadened through the concept of fields, first introduced into science by Michael Faraday in relation to electric and magnetic fields, then through Einstein's general theory of relativity, taken to include the gravitational field. And there are many fields in science now. Fields are defined as regions of influence. They're usually invisible. The gravitational field of the Earth is in the Earth, but extends far beyond it. The reason we're not floating in the air at the moment is because it's holding us down to the ground. It's invisible. This room is full of it, but we can't see it. It holds the moon in its orbit. It stretches far beyond the Earth. The gravitational field of the moon affects the tides on the Earth. So these are invisible fields with enormous effects at a distance, even though you can't see them. Gravitational, electrical and magnetic fields also stretch out beyond physical objects. A magnetic field stretches out far beyond the magnet. You can reveal its lines of force through sprinkling iron filings around it, but the field itself is invisible. And the electromagnetic fields of your mobile telephone are within the mobile telephone, but stretch invisibly beyond it. This room is full of radio transmissions from mobile phones, from radio and television programs. The world is full of invisible fields. This is a revelation of 19th and 20th century science, which I don't think has been taken on board by people thinking about materialist theories of the brain. And what I'd like to suggest is that our fields of our minds stretch out far beyond our bodies. They stretch out invisibly, and our consciousness is related to and based on these fields. That if we're going to solve the hard problem, taking into account fields of the mind may be a very important ingredient, as well as studying processes within the brain. The easiest way to see what I'm talking about is indeed through vision. What's going on when you see something? Well, everybody knows that light comes into the eyes. Ever since Johann Kepler in 1604 worked out that there were inverted images on the retina, we know that the lens focuses the light in each eye. You have a small inverted image on your retina. Changes happen in the cone cells and the rod cells. Impulses travel up the optic nerve. Changes happen in various regions of the brain. All this has been mapped and scanned in greater detail than ever before. But the mysterious part is then what happens next. How do you create images, three-dimensional, full-color images, which Anil calls controlled hallucinations? How does the brain create those? They're all supposed to be inside your head, representations of the outer world. So I can see you sitting there, you can see me here, but all of you are supposed to be inside my head, as lots of faces and the whole of this room is meant to be. And inside your head is supposed to be a little Rupert, somewhere inside your brain. That's not what we actually experience. What we actually experience is that our images are out there. Your image of me, I'm imagining, is where I'm actually standing right now, and my image of you is where you are. So this one-way theory of vision, which we've all grown up with, which comes from Kepler, the intromission theory of vision, sending in intromission, is taken to be the standard scientific view. But there's another and older theory of vision, the extramission theory, that says not only does light come in, but the images we see are projected out. So my images of you are where they seem to be. They're in my mind, they're in my consciousness, but they're not inside my head. They're where you're sitting. Now this idea was familiar to the ancient Greeks. It's familiar to people all over the world. the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget showed that young European children, in his book The Child's Conception of the World, think that they're projecting out images, that they take it for granted. So this is in fact a very deep-seated way of thinking about vision. And Euclid, the great geometer, used it to explain in the first really clear way how mirrors work. What happens when you look at something in the mirror is the light is reflected from the mirror. The angle of incidence, the angle of reflection are the same. But what happens then is you project out the images, which go straight through the mirror, being virtual mental projections, and you see virtual images behind the mirror. And Euclid's theory is still there in school textbooks to explain mirrors. All of you, no doubt, have seen these diagrams. They involve little dotted lines behind the mirror that go to what's called a virtual image behind the mirror, a projection of the mind behind the mirror. And so this extramission, a sending out theory of vision, is actually taught to all school children, even though within most of science it's regarded as a total heresy. Intromission is the only permissible theory in biology and psychology, whereas in optics, which comes under physics, extramission is the standard theory. And no wonder it's confusing. People are taught two completely different theories of vision. Now, at Ohio State University, Gerald Weiner, who's a professor of psychology, was shocked to find that most adults and children he interviewed believed in visual extramission, something going out of the eyes. Even his own psychology undergraduates believed it. So he called this a fundamental misunderstanding of visual perception. And he decided to re-educate them. And he and his colleagues told them forcefully over and over again, nothing goes out of the eyes when you look at something. And after repeated drilling with this into the students, when they were tested immediately after this denial of extramission teaching, they gave the correct answers. But when they tested them 3 to 5 months later, almost all of them had reverted to their previous views. They were dismayed at this failure of scientific education. Much more recently, in fact just in the last few years, Arvid Gutterstam, working first at Princeton University, now at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, has shown that by some very ingenious experiments that people attribute a gentle force to the gaze as it goes out of the eyes. And they've even shown, using fMRI, that regions of the brain involved in tracking movement are activated. And as he puts it, the results, this is a quote, strongly suggest that when people view a face looking at an object, the brain treats that gaze as if a movement were present, passing from the face to the object. And they found that this occurred even in people who didn't believe in visual extramission. It's deep, hardwired in the way we see. And they tried to explain this by saying there must be an evolutionary reason for it, that it's important to track people's gaze in social situations, and this leads to the illusion that something's going out of the eyes when you look at things. It would make much better sense in evolutionary terms if it's not an illusion, but if it's real. And so is it real? Well, you're not meant to think it's real because that goes against the dogma that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain and the perceptions are inside the head. But is it testable? Well, I think it is. If when I look at you as a projection from my mind that touches you, my mind in a sense reaches out to touch you, if I look at you from behind and you don't know I'm there, could you feel that I'm looking at you? Well, as soon as you ask that question, you realize that the sense of being stared at is very common. It's now called scopaesthesia, the scientific name for it. Scop as in microscope, seeing, aesthesia, feeling, as in synesthesia, anesthesia. Scopaesthesia is extremely common. Most people have experienced it. I'm sure most people in this room have experienced it. You turn around, you find someone's looking at you, or you stare at someone and they turn around and look back. It doesn't happen all the time, but it's very common. Most people have experienced it, including most children. It's usually directional. you turn and look straight at the person, you don't just feel uneasy and search around. I have a recent paper just in the last few weeks on directional scophesthesia showing that on the basis of 960 case studies, the directionality is just a basic feature of this in the way people experience it. I've investigated the natural history. We've interviewed, we've dealt with through questionnaires. We found it typically happens most powerfully with strangers, often with male strangers in situations that could be vaguely threatening. We've done interviews with more than 50 surveillance officers, celebrity photographers, and private detectives, practically all of whom just take this for granted. If you've ever trained to be a private detective, and I'm guessing that most of you haven't, you will have learned that when you're following someone, shadowing somebody, you don't stare at their back, because if you do, they'll turn around, catch your eyes, and your cover's blown. You have to look at them a little bit, otherwise you lose them, but you look at their feet. So among practical people, these things are completely taken for granted. In the martial arts, it's taken for granted, and they have methods of training people to become more sensitive. Because if you can feel when someone's approaching from behind who might attack you, you'll survive better than if you didn't feel it. They train this ability, people get better at it. And I think it should be trainable more widely. My Spanish neuroscientist colleague, Dr. Alex Gomez-Marin, and I are currently developing an app that works on mobile phones. It should be released within a few weeks. We'll announce it on my website. The app, both people have a mobile phone. One tells one person when to stare or not to stare, and the other person who's got their back to them and who's blindfolded has to guess if they're being looked at or not. And they say yes or no, right or wrong. Well, many experiments have already been done on the sense of being stared at. They've been done in at least 37 different schools and colleges. They've been replicated in many parts of the world. The statistical significance is astronomical. At the Nemo Science Museum in Amsterdam, an experiment on the sense of being stared at was running for more than 20 years. More than 20,000 people took part. And it was called Have You Got Eyes in the Back of Your Head? And people had to guess whether they were being looked at or not in a randomized sequence of trials. The results were astronomically significant statistically. I mean, I didn't run this experiment myself. It was run by the Dutch Museum. The results were analyzed by Dutch statisticians, and it showed a massively significant effect. The most sensitive subjects, incidentally, were children under the age of 9. So here we have something which is extremely well known. It's well known all over the world. The scientific evidence suggests it really happens. The scientific teaching of how mirrors work assumes that there's an extramission of influences. It seems to be deeply seated in biology. It happens with animals. Animals can tell when they're being looked at, and when they're and people can tell when animals are looking at them. So here we have a very, very well-known phenomenon, very deep-seated biologically. Many different species of animals have shown this ability. I think it's evolved in the context of predator-prey relationships. A prey animal that could tell when a predator was looking at it, a hidden predator was looking at it, would survive better than one that didn't. And I think it has enormous implications for our understanding of the mind. Because if our minds are not just about what happens in brains, and if our conscious experience is extended through electromagnetic fields, which is what light is, it suggests that minds have an interface with electromagnetism. We know they do in the brain. A lot of brain activity that correlates with consciousness is electromagnetic activity. There seems to be an interface between electromagnetism and consciousness, and why it should be confined to the inside of the head is a purely arbitrary assumption. It comes from René Descartes originally, I suppose, or from the ancient Greek materialists. But Descartes, as Aniel pointed out, made a division between extended things, res extensa, matter, is extended in space, whereas mind res cogitans was not extended in space. It was defined by being unextended. So the idea was the mind was unextended but interacted with the brain somewhere inside the head. So I'm suggesting that actually when we let go of that assumption, which has been so limiting for so long, we can broaden our view of the mind and go further than we've gone so far in a way that will help to solve the real problems leading towards the hard problem. Finally, I just want to say that I think the extended mind doesn't just extend out into the world, it extends throughout the body. And when someone has, say, a phantom limb after an amputation, I think that that phantom limb is part of the extended mind, that people feel the limb to be really there. And I think what they're doing is projecting that image of the limb and feeling it from within as to where the limb actually is. The official view is it's all inside the brain, but I don't think it is. And so I think once we liberate the mind from the brain more generally and consciousness from the brain more particularly, we have a much wider context for discussing this knotty problem, the hard problem of the relation between mind and brain. There are many other ways minds are extended, including the ways that Tanya told us about through these experiences of other forms of consciousness. But those, I think, are subjects I hope we'll take up further in our discussion. But for now, I just want to end by saying that I think when we take into account the extended mind, instead of just arbitrarily confining it to the inside of the head, we're much more likely to make progress in understanding how minds are related to our bodies and to the physical fields through which we see and through which we have our experiences. Thank you.
Well, I hope we have gone some way in helping you liberate your mind from your brain. One of the things I thought would be interesting to start with is this relationship of the me with all the things that I'm going to do. Am I right? I feel when I listen to all three of you that we are moving away from this notion that the little person inside does everything and is control of everything, and that I'm the only person in here. Is that true? Are we moving away from that? Might there be other people in here that aren't just me?
I mean, two-part. I think yes to the first, and maybe yes to the second, depending on what you mean. I think you're absolutely right that there's a movement away from this homuncular view, which you mentioned too, in terms of some views of how neuroscience, materialist neuroscience, might view the problem of vision, that there's, it comes in from the world, and then somewhere inside my skull there's a little me, sort of with a movie screen maybe plastered to the front of my forehead, and a little mini-me looking at that, and pulling some levers and my hands move. But of course, inside that mini-me, you need another mini-me, and mini-me, and so on. And this is the idea of the inner homunculus, and I think that is totally rejected within philosophy and science, and there's no need for it either. And in a way, it's very consonant with a lot of more Eastern philosophical positions in Buddhism and so on. The nature of the self is a process; it's not a thing. It's the way I like to think of it's a collection of perceptions. It's something the brain is doing, and through exactly the same principles that it uses when constructing experiences of the world. So.
But is there a little Rupert inside?
Well,
is Rupert there?
What, inside my head?
Yeah, do you have a little?
There is now, yeah. There wasn't until we started planning this debate. But in some sense, yeah, right? I mean, in some sense, the claim from me is that my brain solves this problem of vision. That is a difficult problem, and it's not fully solved. But in some sense, it's doing it by having a predictive model, a generative model, of the causes of the sensory signals. So in some sense, my brain is encoding a generative model of Rupert Sheldrake and Tanya Lerman, Dave Malone. And so, yes, that's certainly true.
Tanya, you wanted to...
I think that the more time I've spent in this domain, the more I think of the mind is full of people. The more I think of the mind is full of voices. And I mean, psychoanalysis has known this for a long time. But the more you talk to people, I used to think of myself as just having my own inner voice. The more I pay attention to it, the more I see little commands about, what I should wear, what I should eat, what I should do. And the more I realize that those are actually simulacra not only of me, but of other people. That I hear my mom, my dad, my sisters, my teachers, now Rupert and Anil and David, and I improve on them, I change them, whatever. But there's a sort of peopled quality to our awareness that's really pretty striking that we don't really pay attention to. The other thing I want to say is that I think all four of us experience our minds differently. There is enormous variation in the amount of mental imagery, in the amount of representation, in the sound of our inner voice, in the amount of our inner voice, in what we remember our inner voice as doing. And there's also something I think Anil will see that there's probably a pretty big gap between what actually we experience our minds as being and what we remember our minds as experiencing. And I think that those two probably interact.
But I think it's indisputable that we all experience other beings in our dreams. I mean, we all dream, whether we remember them or not. And when I dream, I have another body, which is not the same as my physical body, which is lying asleep in bed. I have a dream body, and we all do. We have a center of consciousness that moves around, can run around, talk, sometimes fly. We meet other people in our dreams all the time. And so that even if we don't have them in waking life, we certainly have them in dreams. So I don't think there's any question that everybody has other little people in their consciousness. Now, to where they're located is another question. Where are our dreams located? I mean, the normal standard materialist view is they must be inside the head because everything's in the brain. But most people in traditional cultures, and perhaps in our own for a long time, thought that people traveled in their dreams. And so...
That's why Edward Tyler thought that humans came up with the idea of religion, that because you dream and you feel that you are not in your body during your dream, therefore there must be a soul, and therefore there must be spirit.
Well, I think it's a perfectly persuasive line of thought, personally. And there are, if you think about life after death, which is a way of expanding our view of consciousness beyond what we've discussed so far. Maybe we shouldn't go too far. But life after death, I think is best thought of, and at least if I think about it at all, I think of it as being like dreaming from which you can't wake up. Now, Anil doesn't believe in it because on page 1 of his book, he tells us that when you die, there's total oblivion. He doesn't argue why there's total oblivion. He takes it for granted.
Well, it's not entirely fair. I mean, you're right that that's what I argue. I mean, that's what I say. But there's a reason for saying that.
Yes. Well, all right. What is it?
Well, the reason.
That's what I like. Open
discussion. Well, I want to get back to dreams as well. But the reason for saying that, it comes from a little bit the example of general anesthesia, which is about as close to death as any of us will get without actually dying. And that does seem to entail oblivion. It does seem to lead to the suggestion that there's one thing, even though consciousness is not fully understood, if there's one thing that is abundantly clear is this intimate relationship between the brain and conscious experience. You can accept that and still have a range of positions about other things that might influence it or where it might be in some sense. But it's pretty clear that you change the brain, your experience changes, and you stop the brain and your experience stops. And back to the question of self, the interesting thing about the self is we're moving away from this view of it being a single essence that is doing the perceiving, making the decisions, thinking the thoughts. William James said the thoughts themselves are the thinkers. And it's a process, and that process at some point ceases to be a process. So, of course, I don't know for sure, but you probably might all agree that science never gives you directly the truth. It just gives you the evidence, and the evidence we have suggests extremely strongly that when your brain stops, you stop. And on dreams, by the way. So I was thinking of this when you were talking, because you were saying that, like, okay, in some sense, so if I'm seeing, we're both looking at this crowd of beautiful people here, and where is that experience? Is it out there where those people are? I don't think so. You think so. But if I'm having a dream, as I will later have a dream, or a nightmare this evening about this conversation, and again I have the experience of the people out there throwing fruit at me, or you, I don't know. Where is that? Is that, it's not in my hotel room, probably not. So a simpler explanation seems to be that the mechanisms generating both experiences are within the brain, and that explains why, and the fact they seem to be out in the world is a property, a very understandable property of how the perceptual mechanisms within my brain work. If you have the alternative explanation that, oh no, in dreams my soul has gone off somewhere and started traveling around. I mean, of course you can't 100% rule that out, but it seems a very unparsimonious explanation for the experience of dreaming and its similarities and dissimilarities to normal perception.
Although it's also true that if your evidence was not based on what you see in the lab, but based on what happens when you talk to people, the evidence would be overwhelming that something like a soul exists. It is very hard to find a social world that does not believe in gods and spirits. I do not have a horse in this race. But I just want to point out that, I was raised in a Unitarian church in which people believe in at most one God. So I find myself very comfortable in settings where people do or don't, I don't know what I really believe, but I do want to point out that is an idiosyncratic point of view.
Absolutely, and I think this is a really, really important thing to dwell on for a second, that scientists can often be too quick to dismiss what people say about their experience. And it's absolutely important to take this data into account as phenomenology. We need to understand what people's experiences are like, and they are different, and they may be different in very fundamental ways.
But would you expect to necessarily capture God or spirit in the lab?
If you can make it testable, I will try. But
is it conceivable? So here's one of my puzzles.
Yeah.
This is why I'm torn between you and Rupert. Because I think that you can make a coherent argument that there is an insubstantial something, an insubstantial substance that escapes characterization with the tools of science. And it's that there is something like an extended mind in your sense. And I think it's possible that you couldn't prove it.
This may be, but it's so the way I would see it is that if we're going to appeal to something that cannot be sort of explained within a scientific framework, that should be a last resort, and we should do our best to explain it otherwise. And that means taking people's reports of their experiences seriously, but not taking them literally. And I think that is the value that science can have. It can validate people's experiences of that they have a soul. And of course, this differs culturally too. In Hinduism, the soul, and you'll know this much better than me, is associated more with breath rather than with rational mind. And for me, that's much more consonant with the basic experience of being a living creature. So there's much to be learned from these descriptions of things that may not be themselves testable. But people used to believe strongly that the Earth was at the center of the solar system. And of course, that is not evidence that the Earth is in fact the center of the solar system.
Absolutely.
In fact, it is not.
Absolutely. And one of the things that happens to me, and I think it might be true for you, when you listen to what people say, it's even if you as a non-committed person, it's hard to take everybody literally, right? So at some point, you're making a judgment that you're coming to some kind of judgment that this is what you're looking at, and this is not what and because there are many different ideas about God, there are many different ideas about spirits. People are using words to describe their own experience. The words always fail. But then I find myself focusing on the human side, the thing that I can describe, the commonalities that I can describe. I'm always also, though, struggling with or aware of there's so much there that I cannot capture, see, or understand. And then, you're left with mystery.
Can I pick up on something you said? You talk about oblivion when anesthesia makes your brain go to sleep. But that's not quite the same thing as proof that the brain, therefore, is producing consciousness, because I've had the experience of a component of my radio breaking, and there's oblivion inside my radio. But the radio station and the transmission have not stopped. So is it... I mean, you seem to be advancing the idea of the brain produces consciousness, and as you were saying, I have a dog in this race. It could be that it's more like a radio. It tunes it in, and that it hasn't ceased just because one of the components has stopped. Would that count as a scientific view or just mumbo jumbo?
No, so you have to ask so firstly, I think you're right in the sense that that is an alternative explanation for the oblivion that general anesthesia induces. I try to remain a little bit agnostic. I think the language that the brain produces consciousness is itself laden with all kinds of assumptions. It's almost dualistic in a sense. So, the brain might produce it, it might be identical to it in some ways, or it might entail it. So I think that these are all kind of subtle distinctions. It's important to not fall into any one of them without realizing what you're doing. It's also possible that the brain is some kind of receiver for some consciousness that's happening. But that seems, again, a relatively unparsimonious explanation for why consciousness stops when the brain stops, because you have to then sort of explain how it's receiving consciousness, where else it is, what the mechanisms are that might lead to this phenomenon. And you have to try and make it testable somehow. So it's not impossible, but then what explanatory role is this playing too? Again, if I don't just turn the brain completely off as in anesthesia, but just change part of it, stimulate part of it, damage part of it, our conscious experience changes in very predictable ways. Now, you could say it's a very complicated receiver inside here. So if you damage a little bit of it, you remove the ability for it to detect radio 4, but you can still tune into radio 5 live. But then you start, it starts to become a very strange kind of explanation where all of a sudden your receiver is as complicated as the whole system of radio broadcasting itself. And so what's the point of proposing something else?
Fair enough.
Well, to come back to a much more sort of practical level of normal vision, you see, taking your idea of controlled hallucinations, which you say are projected, what I can't understand is why the hallucination, being a hallucination, can't go through the skull. Why the skull is an insulating barrier that keeps the hallucination inside the head.
Well, so actually, this brings up something you said about fields, and I think you're absolutely right to bring up the point of fields, because fields are non-local, and they do extend, and it is indeed true that neural activity generates electromagnetic fields, and this is the basis of a lot of our brain imaging methods. And these electromagnetic fields do extend beyond the skull, otherwise these imaging methods wouldn't work. But they are extremely, extremely weak. And this is why imaging doesn't work at a very long distance at all. So EM, electromagnetic fields do exist, but there is not a candidate other kind of field that we know of in physics that could do the kind of projection you're talking about. And nor do I think we need one, because I think it again comes back to our conversation. The property that our experiences seem to be out there in the world does not mean they actually are, but it is a phenomenological observation that deserves to be taken seriously, and philosophers since Hume have already done that. Evolutionarily, it would be very weird if our perceptual systems had evolved so that we experienced things to be in our minds rather than in the world. And this does sometimes happen in some kinds of visual hallucination. So it's no mystery at all to me that mechanism within the brain can create a perceptual experience that seems as if it is out there in the world. And that seeming as if is something that can change. In synesthesia, it's a condition where people have a mixing of the senses. They're often not perceived to be out there in the world. So it's something that can be manipulated in a way that tracks again to differences in the brain.
But one of the things that I think I'm hearing is that different kinds of methods, different ways of gathering data, change the way in which you relate, one relates to what one takes to be true. Because one of the things that I find is, and I think, Rupert, this is true for you, is that when I sit with people, if I don't allow myself, if I'm not able to be in a point of view in which I can recognize that it's possible for the universe to be far bigger than I might expect. People talk differently. People don't, and I actually hear what they say differently. I need to be in a position of ontological neutrality in order to hear clearly what the people that I'm talking to are trying to tell me. And then I'm dancing back and forth between, okay, what do I think is true? What I think is this person saying? But there somehow has to be this openness. And I think that's different from the kind of work that you do. And that's just kind of interesting.
One of the things in your work is you make the point quite late on in your book that how people think about their own mind changes who they are and what they are and how that mind works. Does that include the sort of the materialistic, reductionistic worldview? And if you think that your mind is just reducible to electrical currents, do you become a different kind of human being?
I've been wondering about that. So one of the things that I find so moving when people talk to me about beings that talk back is that I see a richness in their experience. I see an aliveness in their world. And there's a piece of me that envies some of the intense commitments of my evangelical Christians. The world somehow is, to be an evangelical Christian is to be committed to the view that you are happy. And sometimes I listen to this and I think, why are these people telling me that they're so happy? But then they also kind of look pretty happy. And so there's a way in which trying to manage, and I see people managing their own awareness of themselves. And I think there may be some truth to what you've said.
Well, I'd like to ask you, Tony, when in your book, How God Becomes Real, you point out that for people who are religious in various different cultures, they have to do a lot of things to have these experiences, rituals, singing, prayers, and so on. Does the opposite apply for those for whom God becomes unreal? Because, as you point out, it's a historical anomaly. Modern Western post-Christian Europe and lots of North America, where a large number of people are secular, and if not atheist, agnostic at least, where God has become unreal, which is very unusual in the whole history of humanity. Do you think that requires a conscious effort? I mean, for example, to maintain a materialist belief, usually for material that I know involves filtering out all experiences of the sense of being stared at. It's just a coincidence. Telepathy, you just remember when you're right, you forget when you're wrong, that's a coincidence too. It involves quite a lot of effort denying phenomena which occur to them in their lives and avoiding things that would make God more real.
So I have a colleague, Justin Barrett, who makes exactly that argument. He says, look, in the course of world history and the diversity of societies that we know of, there's such a tiny number of people who are truly atheists. There are lots of semi-believers over the course of, I think people always mark supernatural, spiritual things as different in kind, epistemically different in kind than tables and chairs. But I think that it's relatively unusual to have people who have very particularly materialistic beliefs. So I think you can make that argument. But I also see is that people who developed a very intimate relationship with an invisible being, particularly when that invisible being is very, very powerful, and they decide they don't believe in that being anymore, that can be devastating. It can be really hard. So that, particularly if somebody is the kind of Christian in which they grew up in a church in which that church, they grow up in a kind of church in which they feel that their God has a particular view about their sexuality or about their political beliefs, and they decide that those are wrong beliefs. They disagree with their God. It can feel for a while as if they're being suffocated from within. It's so hard to manage that people talk about the need to deconstruct their life and reconstruct their sense of who they are.
It's almost, I mean, most things in technology have like a dual use, right? So it's almost as if religion is a dual use social technology. It can provide people with a lot of comfort and enchantment and enrichment, but of course it can go the other way too.
Absolutely. That's why you have to be, in effect, I am very impressed by when people choose a God that works for them, how amazing that can be for them. I also see that people can be unlucky in what creeps into their concept of God and the kinds of rules that God expects them to follow.
Is there a difference between truth, with a capital T, which science in the West tends to feel that it owns the way to truth, and things that are important? What I'm thinking of is, if you took the view that you should only believe those things that are true, and that's what, then you would have to say, well, don't read Shakespeare, because none of it is true. But would it be important to read things which aren't true, but have an importance? And it's sort of, in other words, do we impoverish ourselves by saying we should really just concentrate on the things which we can prove to be objectively true?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's been a long rolling discussion in philosophy about whether you can derive aught from it. Yes. Whether knowing what is the case can motivate moral principles, and this just rumbles on and on as to whether it's demonstrable or not. But I think in practice, science and a scientific worldview, which isn't, by the way, it isn't purely reductionistic. I think there's just as a slight sidebar, it's important to distinguish the general scientific commitment that things are explicable, that causes basically run down. You're not imputing weird stuff that suddenly appears at different levels. Ultimately, it's all quarks in the void, or whatever our fundamental level might be. And a more methodological, broader perspective, which is that, okay, if I want to explain human psychology, I'm not going to do it in terms of individual quarks. I'm going to do it at at the level of psychological constructs, and perhaps the adjacent levels, neurons on one side, other people at the other. And emergence in this sense, I think, is real and true. We can talk about different levels, that's fine. So reductionism often gets a bit of a bad rap, I think unnecessarily so. But yes, I think what we find out about the nature of the world in terms of well-justified beliefs, in terms of evidence, can inform what is important and what is not important. But it doesn't exhaustively describe that realm. I mean, your example of Shakespeare makes the point very well. Of course, reading literature, even though it's not objectively true, is of course important and useful because and demonstrably so, because it can shape our understanding of how people act and behave and lead to a better world in that way.
So there can be things which are important for us which aren't true, but that's not the point. We shouldn't get sidetracked saying, well, was Macbeth truly the way that Shakespeare wrote him? And so some things, as I said, they're important, not necessarily true. But is that enough for you, Rupert? Because I suspect for someone to say, well, look, yes, what you're talking about are things that are important, but in and then in parenthesis, but they're probably not true, but let's not talk about that. I think you think they are also true in this more objective sense. Is that right?
Well, I think that the extended mind, I think things like the sense of being stared at are true. I think they happen.
Not
Most
just
people
important,
think
but
they
true.
happen.
Not just important, but true.
True.
Okay.
And I think that other forms of the extended mind, which are taboo from the point of view of materialism, like telepathy, which most people have experienced. About 85% of people have had the experience of thinking of someone who then rings on the phone and they say, "Funny, I was just thinking about you," or know who it is when they call. I've done a lot of research on this. It's not just coincidence, it's not just forgetting when you're wrong. You can do controlled experiments, you have 4 callers, you pick the caller at random, the experimenter picks the caller at random, they call the subject who's being filmed, and they have to guess before they pick up the phone who's calling, and they're right much more than chance. It's been replicated and so on. I think that's true. I think the evidence is quite strong that our minds extend through attention, which literally means stretching towards, ad tendere, and intention, into the world and affect others at a distance. That's one reason I think that it's not just a construct or a way of thinking of how things are happening inside the head, not just limited to the brain. I think it's also the case that consciousness, I don't know if this is true or not, but the idea that consciousness is confined to brains is an assumption as well. I call it the cerebrocentric view of consciousness. It only exists in the whole universe is unconscious, according to the normal materialist view. Galaxies, stars, the whole planets, the whole thing's unconscious, except for human brains on this planet where it's emerged, and possibly animal brains as well. That consciousness is somehow confined to this very tiny part of the universe. We happen to be lucky enough to be part where it is. The alternative view is the panpsychist view that there's levels of consciousness even in atoms and molecules. And I would say not just in atoms and molecules and animals and plants, but in the sun, in the galaxy, in the whole galactic system, and maybe the whole cosmos. Consciousness may not be confined to brains at all. And our whole discussion so far has really been revolving around the idea that, well, not the whole discussion, but a lot of it, that it's all about the brain.
Well, I was relying on you to get to pan-consciousness.
Well, so I think, there's a serious debate within philosophy and science at the moment about panpsychism. Part of it is motivated by the hard problem, because some conservative materialists who radically conservative, let's say, think, well, you can solve the hard problem not by lots of research on the brain, as Anil believes, but just by saying, well, a little bit of consciousness in an electron, a little bit more in an atom, a bit more in a molecule. And so by the time you get to the brain, it's a difference of degree, not of kind. And once they've got to the human brain, they stop, because they've solved the hard problem by attributing tiny bits of consciousness to atoms. I myself think if you're going to argue that kind of way, why stop at the brain? Which is why I wrote a paper called Is the Sun Conscious?, published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, exploring the idea that the sun may be conscious, and the interface between its activity and its consciousness may be its electromagnetic field. And the sun may indeed have actions it controls consciously. The whole galaxy might be conscious, and the different solar systems within it may be like cells in the body of the galaxy, of a greater consciousness. There may be many levels of consciousness in the universe. And so therefore it's not all about the brain. And no, I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to me very plausible, and it also fits with many traditional views of nature. So I take seriously the idea of panpsychism without necessarily believing it's true, whereas I do think telepathy in the sense of being stared at are probably true.
So what I'm struck by is that I'm not sure, I don't know where I sit on the belief that the sun is conscious, but I do think that it is an ethically more effective way to be in the world, to treat the entire world as alive. And so one of the arguments that's emerging out of my field is that if humans did accept a more animistic, panpsychic, vision of the world as being alive, we wouldn't have gotten ourselves into the mess of climate change in the first place. We would have had more respect for the Earth.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting, whether it's back to your point about this, whether it's distinctly truth and importance. And it is kind of tricky if there are some things that we kind of know to be not true, but are still nonetheless useful if we still believe them, because we might do things a bit differently.
Yes.
But I did want to, because I think this is really critical. And I mean, I know we're not going to resolve this here, but this, well, I don't, maybe we will. But
there'll be a refund later.
But when it comes to these things like telepathy and the sense of being stared at, there is, on the one hand, I think it's absolutely right to say that people have these experiences. I think it's also absolutely right to say there are probably good evolutionary reasons why people have these experiences, because it's important, certainly for creatures like us, to be sensitive to gaze direction, to what people are looking at. And in some of your examples about private detectives, that's also, it's fairly clear and I think very plausible to me that you really don't want to be staring at the back of someone. Not necessarily because the staring at the back will make them turn around, but in case they do turn around, you don't want to be looking at them when they do, because then they will get you. So it's very easy to, I think, understand these strategies without an appeal to the reality of this, as something that is empirically the case. So I totally with you on these points of it's a phenomenon worth understanding and being very deep-seated biologically and very ordinary in everyday life. But the key question for me here is, does it actually exist, or is it something that we can account for its presence as an experience, but it's not a real force? And you have claimed that there's astronomically significant statistical evidence for this.
Yes.
And I'm not yet convinced by that. And I know we don't want to necessarily spend the next hours detailing the evidence, but it's the kind of, in psychology, as I think many people might know, there has been something of a replication crisis anyway. A lot of things.
Do you want to explain what you mean by that?
So, there's just a lot of results in the psychological literature that when people have tried to repeat the experiments, the results aren't there anymore. In fact, there's a pretty reliable effect that maybe it's the opposite of morphic resonance, actually. The more often you try to replicate something, the less replicable it becomes over time. And this has been very well documented, and there are various reasons why this might be the case, because people realize more problems the more often you try to do something. So things in general are not standing up, which should, I think, give us pause and greater motivation to be skeptical of results in general. And I include in those from my own lab too, which I now would want to go back and replicate again, because there are all kinds of influences, like and I know you've written about these things like experimenter bias, the level of randomness when you're trying to randomize things, and so on and so forth. And the gold standard now is to really set out well in advance what your predictions are, have things done by totally independent labs, and fix all the problems in one go. So in my view, having one extremely convincing experiment is much more convincing than having a lot of experiments that all point the same way, but each of which is individually flawed. And I'm totally open to that kind of evidence, because if this is true and not just if it's more than just a well-understood experience, well-motivated experience that people have for all sorts of other reasons, then this does change an awful lot. So I would say bring it on, but we need to do it in a way that is going to be immune to the kind of replication crisis that we've observed in the rest of the behavioral sciences.
Well, I completely agree. I mean, it's a scientific question: do these things happen or not? And it's also true that the replication crisis affects not only psychology, but biomedicine and many other branches of science. This happened around 2015, when it was discovered that about 90% of papers in prestigious biomedical journals couldn't be replicated. Incidentally, by contrast, you see, parapsychologists have been accused by skeptics for years and years and years of having non-replicable results, only publishing positive results and not negative results, and so forth. And the result is that if you do a survey of blind methodologies, in parapsychology, about 85% of published experiments involve blind methodologies to protect against bias, compared with about 30% in psychology, 25% in medicine, and less than 1% in the so-called hard sciences, which are unprotected science. Now, so parapsychologists for years have published negative results as well as positive results. And it's actually the Ganzfeld telepathy experiments, nothing to do with me. It's a whole lot of people in many labs through the world have done this work, have been replicated in at least 38 different labs and experiments, and meta-analyses show powerful effects. So I think we agree it's a scientific question. We disagree about the value of the results so far. But I personally, and we also agree that if they're true, they're very important because they actually mean that the mind is more extensive than the brain if my thoughts can influence someone on the other side of the world.
But I also think we disagree slightly on the need for that kind of explanation, because I tend to think that the more valuable, compelling explanations are those that we already have the resources to come up with in terms of things happening within brains. It's not as if there's something for which we really need a new way of explaining in order to account for it, in order to understand people's phenomenology, which is to Tanya's point. People have this interesting phenomenology, and I think that's easy to account for with the resources that we already have. But I totally agree.
I don't think it's to do with phenomenology. Say in these telephone telepathy tests, you can do tests with people in Australia. You have 4 people in Britain. You pick one of the 4 as a caller at random, the experimenter. They phone up the person in Australia. Before they pick the phone up, they have to guess who it is. 1 in 4, 25% chance of getting it right by pure guessing, with success rates that come in around 45 to 50% over hundreds of trials. Highly significant. It's not just phenomenology in the brain. There's some way in which they do actually know who's calling, in a way that any amount of brain scanning is never going to reveal.
I actually think that this is not necessarily a scientific question. I see that you're having a scientific disagreement, and I can see that this scientific disagreement could go on into the night. But I think that the deep question here is actually an ethical and an existential one. The question of how you imagine. I mean, I think you're both right in your own way. But I think there's something deep about and existential about the way that you choose to understand the nature of consciousness for yourself, because we know that the way that you understand it changes your own experience and changes who you become, and that's a powerful, important question. In some sense, that's why I don't think it matters whether God exists. I think it matters how you understand yourself in relationship to what you see as the ultimate good.
Well, I don't take such a relativistic position as you do. I think if something like telephone telepathy does exist, and most people think it exists because they've experienced it, and most people think that their sense of being stared at exists because they've experienced it, not because they've studied statistical evidence in scientific journals.
But Anil does have a point. I mean, you can make sense of those phenomenological experiences by looking at the human dimension of how people come to have these events.
Well, no, I don't think so. If people have these experiences, it may be because they're really happening, not just because they prefer a worldview in which these things can.
That's fine. I mean, people have the experiences that they say they have. And, the other example you gave is the phantom limb case, which again I think is very interesting, that people have this experience of a limb still being there or still hurting after amputation. And that, again, that's a really important experience for the people in question, because it's usually very aversive. And it would be great to try to understand what's going on there, to try to ameliorate it. And there's a very natural, materialist explanation for why people have phantom limbs, that the body encodes a model of, the brain, encodes a model of the body, and amputating a limb just doesn't update that model sufficiently, so the sensory information that the brain is getting or not getting doesn't match the model, and pain results in some sort of very broad brush way. And then you can find ways to fix it by giving people virtual reality limbs, the right kind of feedback, and you find that, okay, now there's a way to treat this and reduce the phantom pain. The fact they feel the pain in the limb doesn't mean that's where the pain actually is. That's where the brain is attributing the pain to be. And taking that view, independently of whether it's true or not, although I think it's closer to being the true picture, is also the more helpful view to take when you're trying to treat it.
I'm not denying it's helpful to have these mirror things and treating pain that way. But for me, it's a really interesting scientific question, a scientific question, as to whether the phantom limb is really where it seems to be or not, and whether it's just projected by the brain, or whether there's a field of the limb there.
Well, what evidence is there that there's a field of the limb there?
Well, some experiments I've done myself, I wouldn't claim this is conclusive because it's only preliminary, but I'll tell you the experiment because it's to illustrate you can test it. What we have is a barrier, like a door. I recruit amputees with arms, missing arms, which I did through the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association. So I have an amputee on one side of the door. I have 6 panels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the door. My assistant throws a dice to get a random number between 1 and 6, and we ask the amputee to push their hand through panel 2, for example. On the other side of the door, I have people who claim to do subtle energy healing, Reiki or other things. So they're in this room. I don't know which, it's blind, I don't know which has got the phantom limb. Phantom limbs, being phantoms, go through solid objects. People experience them as going through solid objects. So I say to these people, look, here's 6 areas. One of them's got a phantom limb sticking through it and the others haven't. Which one's got the phantom limb? And they feel in these different places. And they say, if it was just guessing, it would be 1 in 6, and the hit rate is very much significantly above that. Now, you might say, well, it's not just guessing, because otherwise they would be at the child's level. You could say it's subtle cues, they feel heat from the other side, or small noises and stuff. But, and it needs replicating and so on. It's a cheap experiment, it costs almost nothing. It's really hard to persuade people to do it, because even though it's cheap and simple, it's, for amputees it's not hard to persuade them. It's hard to persuade scientists to do it, because it goes against the standard materialist view. But all I'm saying is it's a testable possibility. It's not just brain mechanisms, and you've got to take it to that as a matter of theory. You can test it.
I just want to move us on, if you don't mind, because a lot of the discussion is often, what is the evidence that we should believe claims such as Rupert's? But let's just for a moment go the other way. And my question to you would be, do we have any theories at all which tell us how you can take the same atoms that are in my shoes, a bit of sulfur, a bit of phosphorus, some iron, some carbon, and mix them up in such a way, wire them up, that in a particular kind of way they go, oh, hello. There you are. Do we have any theory that bridges that gap at all? The reason I ask is because I could sense with my psychic abilities that when we were talking about panpsychism, a large proportion of people out there were going, that cannot be true. But the other alternative is the one that I put you. There's brute matter. Somehow, by some magical business, there's a certain way of wiring up, and it does go, hello.
Well, we hope not magical in the end. And
No, not magical. I use the term to be provocative.
That's the beautiful thing, I think, about the scientific method. That
But do we have anything after?
We have things that are making progress. I think I was trying to be very sort of modest and clear about this in the talk. That many of my colleagues might differ in terms of this. So some think we do. We have the explanation. Most people, I think, would be more modest that that there's progress towards it, that demystifies it to some extent. There's one theory, which is this. I alluded to it very briefly, the Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory. I don't want to get into that too much now, but it does claim to have solved the hard problem head on, and it's a very weird, counterintuitive theory that sort of actually entails a kind of panpsychism, which is a...
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I've read that theory, and it assumes something, but it doesn't prove it.
No, but it makes very testable, counterintuitive predictions that are being tested. Which, if they turn up, doesn't prove the theory, but it increases the credence we should have in that theory. So many theories can't be proved or disproved by a single experiment. That's quite rare. What you do is you gradually increase or decrease your credence in different theories according to the relative weight of evidence for that theory and how that distinguishes it from others. Now, when it comes to consciousness, I don't think there is yet a theory which completely bridges that gap, that gives us this intuitive sense of, aha, of course, now I understand how this electrified pate in my skull is also, at the same time generating or identical to the redness of red. But what's interesting, I think, is that there are several theories which explain aspects of that and change our view of the problem at the same time. From being one big scary mystery to being a bunch of related mysteries that lead us to already think of some central concept differently, like, for instance, the concept of free will. People have often asked, does free will exist or not? It depends. It depends on whether you're still cleaving to a view of free will as some kind of uncaused cause that swoops in and makes things that happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. Now, that's a view of free will that's very, very hard to defend. It's very hard to know what it would even mean for that to be the case. There's a recent book by Robert Sapolsky which sort of says, well, that doesn't exist, therefore a whole bunch of moral and ethical things follow. I think that's missing the point slightly. We have experiences of free will, and this is back to the, I think, core emerging theme of this discussion: to take people's experiences seriously, but not necessarily take them literally. How else can we understand the experience of voluntarily doing something, having the intention to do something? Turns out to be much more complex and interesting and ethically important, in this case in things like the law, when you hold people responsible for their actions and when you don't, than trying to resolve the brute question, does free will exist or not? So that, I think, is the promise and potential of, I feel I am being Cassiner, like the defender of the establishment view here, but there are many branches of this materialistic view, but they do change our view of the problem too, and eventually I think it's quite possible that we will come to an established theoretical view about consciousness, which we get comfortable with. But I think that might take a while, and I think part of the reason it might take a while is because we ourselves are conscious, and you mentioned this, Tanya, that our beliefs about consciousness impact our everyday lives. And what would it feel like to fully believe and understand that what it is to be me, how that emerges from a biochemical soup inside my head? What would that? No, I don't think so. Oh. I do not think so. I think this is another big mistake people often caricature about science, that it's that understanding things as having this basis in physics, chemistry, whatever it might be, somehow denudes these phenomena of their meaning, power, and beauty. And I think this is almost never the case. The universe became much grander when we discovered that we were not at the center of it. Our picture of life became much more beautiful and enriched when we discovered that we're related to all other creatures. And I'm optimistic that a scientific view that grounds consciousness in physics, in chemistry, doesn't denude it of its beauty and its meaning, but it enriches it, and we'll see ourselves more as part of nature and less apart from it. And in that, I think, we probably all agree. Well, no, it doesn't. It's not saying that consciousness is everywhere. It's just saying there's nothing special that sets us apart from the rest of the universe. And the whole history of the scientific worldview can be thought of as a sequence of recognition that we are continuous with nature and not separate somehow above it.
But that it does sound like panpsychism.
Well,
that's the description of panpsychism that Rupert gave, which I love.
But it isn't panpsychism. Panpsychism is literally the claim that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous. Now, to see ourselves as continuous with nature doesn't mean that. It's the same way as like life is a property of the world. No, it's not. Life is a property of physics and chemistry. It doesn't mean everything is alive. So I think it's an important distinction.
I don't know. I still think it sounds like details. I love the image. But I do think that, and I'm not opposed to, I think that our ideas about who we are will change continuously over the next how many ever years we have left to us. But there is, to arrive at the puzzle that Sapolsky tries to wrestle with, it's easy to remove from that struggle the sense of the moral importance of who we are as choosers and actors and movers in the universe. And so
No, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what I'm following.
Well, I thought that you were saying that the idea that free will didn't exist brought us into trouble when we tried to think about breaking the law. That we needed to think differently. There were different levels of understanding. That's its own metaphor. But I'm not against the idea of a reductive explanation. But it did sound as if the description that you gave was to kind of extend aliveness to the world and to create a kind of sense of ethical responsibility to the world.
Well, I think we should cultivate that anyway. I think and there are very good reasons to do that and you can do that without having to believe that everything is alive or that everything is conscious. You just recognize that we depend directly or indirectly on how our planet is working and how our world is working. I think that's reasonable. But on the free will thing, I guess it's having a more ramified view where we get away from the opposition that free will in some canonical pre-existing sense of an uncaused cause does or does not exist. Getting away from that opposition to understanding that we are complex biological systems. Some of the things we do are relatively automatic. And if somebody kicks me in the leg, I have a reflex. Some of them are relatively internally generated. I like to drink tea rather than coffee. Why? Because I'm English. Did I choose to be English? No. But it feels voluntary nonetheless. And so there's a whole spectrum of more or less voluntary things that are experienced as more or less voluntary, and of course that's individually different in different cultures and in cases of mental and psychiatric disease. So the picture we get is, I think, more interesting, more rich, and its implications become more complex too. When do we should we ever hold people responsible for their actions? I think it all tilts the dials towards rehabilitation rather than retribution. But there are already cases of people who have successfully been defended on the basis of a brain tumor, let's say, because they wouldn't have done the crime without the brain tumor, but then as we understand more about the brain, it's basically brain tumors all the way down. So
Which is a very depressing vision.
That's not the most beautiful picture. I was in the pain. But it just makes it, it becomes more than a philosophical discussion. It becomes something that has moral, empirical, and legal grip.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that level of, because we could get stuck at the level of, well, does it really exist or doesn't it? But in your work, and to some extent yours as well, is it true that human beings can make things, and then once we've made them, they exist in the world? I mean, we're used to the idea that we can make a biro and then it exists. If we make a god, does that God exist in a way which is important and defensible, the same way that I've made the biro and now that exists, or that I make writing and it exists?
That is a deep question. I don't have an answer to that question.
Oh.
I know. This ontological...
Well, can you give us a try?
Well, I can say that the God changes people.
Yeah.
So there's a sense...
Fundamentally or just on the surface?
Oh, I think fundamentally.
Okay, so it's not like fashion. I mean, it's something...
No. When people... I mean, at least that's what I see as an anthropologist, as an observer. When I see people using these practices, I can say something about the practices that they practice to help them to experience an external being as real to them. That's not the same as belief, but to experience an external being that's invisible, that they call spirit, that I call
And they
spirit.
actually experience it?
Well, I mean, so I myself keep settling on this ontologically neutral point, which I know is really
You're going to have to explain
annoying.
what you mean by that.
Well, it means that I don't know. So another way of running the kind of argument that Rupert is running is to say that somehow energy, there is a large mind, and we filter pieces of that mind. That mind is somehow alive in the world, and that we filter pieces of that mind into our own awareness. So that's an alternative to the view that there is a particular God or a set of gods that are out there. I don't know what I think about that, but I know that if you make this sense of a being or a presence or an energy which demands of you and to which you are responsible, you change your behavior and you relate to that being in a way that is, I don't know.
And then you do things you wouldn't have done before.
And then you do things you would not have done
There's
before.
now a physical, real effect which biologists, psychologists, and physicists could measure. So somehow you've conjured into being some effect in material reality.
Well, we do that with money.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
money's
one
money
example,
exists
yeah.
too. It doesn't. Yeah, but it only exists because of the beliefs we have about it.
But it
Otherwise,
exists, doesn't it?
Well, it depends what you mean by exist. I think
that's what I'm
it's an idea that can have real causal effects in the world. So if having a real causal effect in the world is what it takes to exist, then yes. But if
And
it's
do
being made of-
ideas exist then?
they have real causal effects in the world.
Do they exist?
So this is a William James perspective.
Yeah, if they
Yeah, I know.
Exists because it changes us.
I'm pushing towards it, yeah.
Right.
But if ideas exist, where do they exist?
Well, so they exist. Depends on what the kind of idea is. Like again, an idea
Money.
like money has to exist in multiple people's minds. If I suddenly decide that my £10 note is worth six grand, it doesn't make it worth 6 grand. At least one other person has to believe that for that to work. So that kind of belief needs to be a collective belief in order for it to have the kind of causal power we ascribe to it. But perhaps other beliefs don't. Perhaps an individual belief in God can change you independently of what other people believe. Though, of course, in practice, it tends to be much more of a collective phenomenon. We attribute power because other people do too.
What I'm struck by is that people seem to follow God's advice more than they follow their own advice. That if they make this being external, they are able to feel compelled by it in a way they are not compelled by their own sense of an inner should.
Why is that? I mean, this brings us to a question from a question we got from someone who's watching, who raises Julian James's idea that in the past people took ideas which they said, this is not my idea, it's from God, and they acted upon it. Mm-hmm. And so it had a reality for them. Is that the sort of thing that you mean, that we're imagining something, but then it has real agency because we somehow give it agency?
It certainly has agency with respect to us.
Yeah.
And so I think that it does. As I think more and more about this, I think that the as-if that we commit to is really pretty important for organizing our own lives. I also think there's a scientific point about Julian Jaynes. So Julian Jaynes said that the way that if you thought about your mind differently, you would experience so he said they didn't have that, the archaic Greeks didn't have an elaborated sense of an inner world. And so they experienced their powerful thoughts as God speaking to them. That's what I see in my work. I see that if you imagine the mind as not bounded, you actually have more hallucination-like experiences. I did not expect to prove Julian Jaynes correct, but it was kind of cool.
Well, there's a whole bunch of teenagers who would applaud because they all read Julian Jaynes when they're 18 and go, this is marvelous.
There's a lot of Julian Jaynes that it's a little.
I mean, he says something
so wonderful.
He says something a bit more dramatic than that, doesn't he?
Yes,
He sort of
I
says
know.
that consciousness itself came into being halfway through the Iliad.
I know,
Which is a
but
bit
it's
more-
still very cool to see that there's some element of that the way that you think about the mind actually changes the texture and shape and the quality of your thoughts.
But Julian James's point is that it came into consciousness, and he puts it at that point in history. Mm-hmm. But presumably you would also have to point to a moment in history where it comes into consciousness, like wandering around a zoo. You know, you have to get to the point where you say, everything to the right, you can't torture because they're conscious. Everything to the left, you can pull its legs off. It's no different than taking the wheel off your car. So you also have to say consciousness comes into existence at a certain point. What would be wrong with Julian Jaynes saying it happened then?
In a certain sense, you're right that there's a point. So this comes back to something Rupert said earlier, that in the view that consciousness is a property of or entailed by the brain somewhere, yes, there were times in the history of the universe and history of our planet where it was just all in the subjective dark. There was nothing going on. Julian Jaynes, I think, it's a 1970s book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
I bought it.
It's batshit crazy, but it's really interesting. And I think he's really talking about self-consciousness rather than perceptual awareness of the world. But I don't know for sure.
No, that's a good distinction.
When it comes to any kind of experience, whether it's elaborated sense of self or something else, yes, at some point, at least if you commit to the idea that consciousness is a biological property intimately related to brains, then yes. And this is a really challenging question, and it's very hard to know, A, where to draw the line, and is it indeed meaningful to draw a line? Some things can just sort of grey out. When does a pile of sand become a pile rather than just a few grains? There are things that don't have a sharp boundary. When does night become day? It's not just when the sun sets. When is the last photon in the sky? So you might not need to appeal to a sharp distinction, but nonetheless we will have an intuition that will cause us to make distinctions. Like, okay, monkeys obviously all right, bacteria on that side. And I think as we get a little bit away, we have to walk the line between anthropocentrism, thinking of ourselves as special, and consciousness being this thing that adheres to more human distinctive kinds of things like language and rational thought, like Descartes trying to do. This is in a sense unavoidable because we know we're conscious, so it's a starting point. But as we begin to figure out why and how that is the case, we can begin to generalize further and further out. But there is no consensus about where that line ought to be, and it's changing. So recently a law was changed, not that recently now, about 10 years ago in the EU, that meant cephalopods like octopuses were now to be treated differently because of the weight of evidence that they may well experience things and not just reactively respond to things. I think a really important current ethical issue is about how we treat fish. We generally don't treat them as if they're conscious in the fishing industry. Perhaps we should reevaluate that position. Personally, that's the grey area where I just don't know. I don't know what to say about a salmon.
Is that to do with the number of neurons, the size of brains?
I mean, it's an easy thing to fall back on, but I think it's an unreliable thing to fall back on. One of the astonishing facts about how consciousness is related to the human brain is that 3/4 of the neurons we have don't seem to matter at all. We have about 86 billion neurons in our brains, roughly, and 3/4 of them are in the cerebellum, which is this mini brain at the back of your head that's very, very important for how we move around the world, for sequencing our language, all these kinds of things. But damage to the cerebellum, or there's some people born without a cerebellum, or have had the cerebellum completely destroyed through brain tumors and so on, perfectly conscious. So it's not a matter of number of neurons. Having lots of neurons might help us have lots of different kinds of conscious experiences. And at some point, it probably matters to some extent. One neuron probably isn't enough. But how many is enough? Nobody knows.
Oh, and another question from someone listening was about hydranencephaly. Mm-hmm. So there's a famous case. That's people who the fluid in their head continues to be produced, and it squeezes out the amount of grey matter they can have. And there was a lot of people who have that are severely brain damaged, but it was a very famous case. I think the chap is still alive, and he was getting a PhD, I think it was at UCL, and they were studying hydranencephaly, and for a laugh they said, let's have a look at you. And his PhD advisor was utterly astonished because he only had 15% of the brain matter of a brain normal person, and was getting his PhD and was a very nice chap, and had none of the cerebral structures which people who then put people's heads in machines say, oh, look, that bit lights up, so it's to do with that. He hadn't any of them, but did all of these things. How does that Does that rock your world or not?
It's incredibly interesting, and but that is rare. You know, most people with
but it only takes
hydroencephaly.
one case. It doesn't matter that it's rare.
Well, it
I mean,
does-
if you've
it
got
does
someone
kind of
born
matter
without
that
a
it's
brain
rare.
and they're normal, then the brain has nothing to do with being normal.
No, but it does kind of matter because it tells you that in most cases that that kind of disturbance of brain development does have consequences. But the fact that it's not always the case, I don't know about this particular case study. It is fascinating. The difficulty in interpreting that in the way of saying like, oh, he doesn't have the parietal lobe, so therefore the parietal lobe is not involved in consciousness. That doesn't follow because it's a developmental thing. And one thing we know about the brain is that it's incredibly malleable. So during development, it can deal with a lot of disturbance and rewire itself in ways that are very different and still preserve the functionality. I was really struck. I've only ever been to see one neurosurgical operation. It's a weird thing where neurosurgeons and neuroscientists almost never meet. But I'm friends with a neurosurgeon who did a very, very extensive operation on a 6-year-old child who had brain damage during birth and had intractable epileptic seizures many times a day. The surgeon exhausted all medicine. The operation was to remove his whole right hemisphere, actually to leave it in the brain but disconnect it from everything. This took 8 hours. And what's astonishing is that that he was fine and fine very quickly. The damage to the right hemisphere had been accommodated by the development of the left hemisphere very, very easily. And if you do it early enough, it's totally fine. If you did that to me, I would not be totally fine. Don't try it.
Right. Rupert, the kind of things that Anil's talking about, do they strike you as important, or do you have that feeling that we're still stuck in a worldview which is ignoring what you're trying to get at?
Well, basically, I think brains are overrated. And I think the hydrocephaly cases show us that normal structure of the brain, in some of them it's only 5% of the normal amount, that consciousness obviously is related to the brain in all sorts of ways, but not in the way it's usually assumed. And so my own view is that consciousness is, because I have a kind of panpsychist view, or put it more technically, my view is what's sometimes called panentheism, the idea that God is in nature and nature is in God. But panpsychist view is that there's a kind of consciousness in the whole universe and in all self-organizing systems within it. It does exclude tables, chairs, socks, and computers because they're not self-organizing, they're made in factories. And it's really about things that have a wholeness that's more than the sum of the parts, which is true of self-organizing systems. So I think all of them have some level of mind, and a lot of mind is unconscious. I mean, the cerebellar function may be habitual and unconscious for the most part. And as Freud and others showed, a lot of our mental activity is unconscious. In fact, as soon as something becomes habitual, it becomes almost unconscious. Consciousness is concerned with making choices among possible actions. I think that's its main role. And therefore it's to do with the realm of possibility and choice. And I think choice is real. I won't get back to the free will argument, but habit is terribly important. And I think most of nature is habitual. And that at every level of organization, atoms, molecules, cells, tissues, organs, plants, animals, planets, solar systems, galaxies, and so on, there's a wholeness that's more than the sum of the parts that organizes them, has some degree of choice, organizing power, wholeness, integration, as in IIT, integrated information theory. It emphasizes the wholeness of all these different levels of organization that they integrate. So I think that when it comes to our own consciousness, it's part of this bigger picture as I'd see it. And now Tanya would no doubt think, well, I must put in an awful lot of effort to arrive at this worldview. I do. I mean, I've written 2 whole books about spiritual practices and how they can change the way we experience things. But I think this is, from a scientific point of view, it's a perfectly valid way of looking at things, a more helpful way. But I think it's also a way in which one can actually experience it. You see, I'm not as agnostic as you about God becoming real. I mean, I believe in God, and I believe in God because I experience a divine presence and a purpose in my life. And so for me, it's a matter of experience. So you could call it mystical experience, but it's sometimes spontaneous, sometimes the result of spiritual practices. And no doubt there are brain mechanisms involved and so on, but for me, it's not just one way of looking at things. It's real because I experience it as real. And you could easily argue others would experience different things as real. But I think for people who've had a mystical experience of God, of a kind of ultimate unity or divine presence, one of the things about it is that it does feel very, very real. It feels more real than anything else. People who have near-death experiences, which sometimes only last a few minutes, have their lives changed by this, what feels to them a direct insight into ultimate reality. And then when I have these experiences myself, I don't claim to be anything special. Lots of people do. Then the question is this just self-delusion? Is this just persuading myself of something that I'd like to believe is true? Should I take the objective scientific view? Then I come to the so-called objective scientific view is actually just a theory. And insofar as it would deny these experiences or say they're nothing but the brain, that's just a theory too. And for me, experience is more important than theory. And partly because if we believe in empiricism, which I do, experience is empirical. That's what empirical means. It means experience. So I think that experience is actually, in the end, for most of us, something that is probably the ultimate arbiter. And if someone comes along and says, oh, well, it doesn't fit with 19th century physics or 21st century physics or something like that, it doesn't necessarily mean it's untrue. It may mean that these scientific views are temporary views which change, and I think our present scientific worldview is in the process of evolution, partly through taking on the very challenge of trying to understand consciousness. And I think we'll have a very different scientific worldview, not only about consciousness, but also about life, because although, Anil, you say, well, life's been solved and this is a model for how to solve consciousness, but you know that you people used to believe in vitalism, we now know that it's so on, that we've chipped away at it. And I don't think the problem of life is solved, and I think we need to have a whole new way of thinking about life as well. So my own view is that the scientific worldview is in the process of growing and expanding, as it always has. And when it does, it will give us a very different basis for thinking about consciousness and for interpreting the kinds of experiences that people have, and which you rightly study, because we wouldn't know about them unless someone studies them. And the fact there's a huge diversity is really important, but there are certain common factors as well, I should imagine.
I was just going to, if you wanted to say something, I was just going to move this on to give Anil a chance to flourish his heretical credentials. Because I do feel that you have had to defend things, and one of the places where you are quite heretical is you say quite clearly you don't think that the brain is computational, that consciousness is not computational, and therefore the hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that claim to be making an artificial consciousness are doomed. Why do you think that?
Right, and actually this is, I think, listening to you, this is an area where, for different reasons, we might end up agreeing with each other to some extent. That I think life is important. I think there's something distinctive and special about systems that self-organize. And I think that's maybe one of the keys to understanding the biological basis of consciousness. So I think this is broadly in line with what you're saying. I also, by the way, don't think that we've solved life entirely. What I mean is that there's no longer a sense of conceptual mystery that life is explicable in terms of physics and chemistry.
Well, I think there is. So we don't agree about
We don't agree about that. Okay, fine.
Can I just
But-
is everyone happy with the idea of self-organized? Or do you want them to explain it?
So,
No, you're happy with it? Good, fine.
okay.
Carry on. I just wanted to check.
Things that self-organize. They organize themselves.
Yes.
Define it another
They don't
way.
have to be organized by
Self-organizing
somebody
systems
else.
organize themselves.
Okay.
So there is this prevailing. So this is where I'm probably the heretic in my community a little bit. Is
Yes.
that there's a prevailing view that's been there certainly since I started out, that the brain is some kind of computer, that the mind is some kind of mindware running on the wetware of our brains, and that consciousness is some form of information processing. And these terms are used almost without giving them any thought, as if it's obvious that what the brain does is process information and that consciousness is a property of getting that right. And that assumption, I mean, that's what licenses all kinds of claims that AI might at some point become not only smart, but also conscious, also aware. And these are assumptions that are having, again, real practical and ethical consequence now, as people are scared of AI for all sorts of reasons, some of which are justified and some of which probably aren't. If you think that your next language model is suddenly going to experience things, and then you're probably not correct about that, and you're not going to see the real risks clearly. So there is this prevailing view. I think it's still a bit of a hangover from this old idea of the brain as a computer, which people say they no longer buy into, but if you look at the language that is used, it reveals a trace of that. And you can certainly describe the brain that way, but it doesn't mean that's what the brain actually is. Other ways of thinking are possible. So yes, I think there are many reasons to push back on that assumption. Firstly, just to recognize that it is a big assumption, and in the brain there's no sharp divide between what we might call the wetware and the mindware. In a computer there is by definition. That's what computers do. You can run different programs on them. In the brain doesn't, where is it, the neurons? No, each neuron is very complex. One neuron fires, the whole structure of the brain changes. There are chemicals washing around. Where do you draw the line again? It's not clear. And on the other hand, the more that you pull on the thread of this idea of the brain as a prediction machine and ask, well, why is it doing that? What's it for? What's it predicting? Why? You realize, at least I am drawn to the view, and I didn't expect to get there. You're drawn to the idea, I'm drawn to the idea that the mechanisms, these predictive mechanisms that underlie our experiences of the world and the self have their roots evolutionarily and developmentally and in the day-to-day business of living in this biological imperative to stay alive. Prediction enables control, it enables regulation. When you can predict, you can keep things within bounds, and that is fundamentally what the brain is for. It's for keeping the body and itself alive. That means keeping things within bounds. That drives down right into our biochemistry, right into the level of individual cells, so that you start to see, this is where the self-organizing thing comes in, that systems that create their own components, that don't just run on components like things made in factories, that self-produce, there becomes this sort of porous boundary between what we might call the dynamics or the information processing and the metabolism, the energetics of the same system. To me, this grounds what brains are doing and what the nature of consciousness in something that is deeply biological, the embodied brain, not just the brain in a vat, but the brain in a body. And the last point here is the phenomenology of consciousness seems to speak to this too. And again, it's not evidence, this is not knockdown evidence that is the case. But if you look deeply, as people with many hours of meditation do, into what the experience of self really is at its core, it's not a thought, it's not this being my body. Arguably, it's a fundamental experience of being a living organism. And this is definitely speculative now, but this gets to some descriptions of what people think about when they think about soul. It's something more to do with breath, something more to do with an experience of being alive. And I think that phenomenology is a clue to the mechanisms that underlie all our experience that become grounded in our nature as living systems. Now, I don't know if this is the case, but I think it's a position that is worth articulating because it is different from what seems to me to be an weakly supported set of assumptions that consciousness is something that a computer could have if you programmed it in the right way.
What do you think, Tony?
So I guess what I am struck by is your last set of comments about feeling alive, and I'm not opposed to that perspective. I think that the experience of meditation captures some of that. What I find so moving is that people feel a sense of an other. They feel a sense of being communicated to. It is so much more common than we imagine. And that's not the feeling of aliveness, that's the sense of a universe sort of pulsating back. And some of these experiences are silly. So I remember a woman in talking to me about her, so this is a Christian, talking to me about her new relationship with God, and she gets onto a bus in Chicago and she thanks God for, it's no longer sleeting, it's winter in Chicago, and she's going on and on about how much worse the winter could be in Chicago than it is now. And she sits on the bus and she's reading her book, and God says out loud to her, "Get off the bus. You're going to miss your stop." It's like a silly little thing, and it meant so much to her. There are other experiences that people have that are more profound. I remember a woman who was working in a 7-Eleven. It was the best job she could get out of college. She didn't want to have the job. Somebody came in, wanted some beer and some cigarettes, and this woman was like, "Oh my God, I'm doing this with my life." And she heard God say out loud, "I have loved this woman, I have created her in my image." Changed this woman's life. And so that, what I hear from people is this rich variety of senses of being spoken to, communicated to, felt to. I think that's also part of the story of consciousness, being in community with others. I don't know whether to call that God myself. I do know that the making of that as a real phenomenon in the world for somebody changes the way they orient themselves to the future, changes the way they orient themselves to the good, and profoundly matters.
If we could make an artificial consciousness, do you think that it would believe in God, or some of them would believe in God, would come up to you one day and say, "I'm an artificial consciousness, but I've experienced God"? And would they perhaps also say, "I've experienced people looking at me"?
Well, it's hard to know whether it's experienced. I mean, we can look at non-living systems to see if any of them respond to being looked at. I think it's quite possible some might. But that's an empirical question. I think if we made an artificial consciousness, it wouldn't necessarily. If we think of the consciousness that may exist already of other animal species, would they believe in God? No, I don't think so, because belief in God would require being able to formulate ideas and so on. But do they have mystical experiences? I think they may. I think a lizard basking in the sun may be in a blissful state of samadhi. We assume that these higher mystical states are available only to humans. I think they're probably what motivate all life. And so I think that they may, even a cell, may have experiences. Maybe for an egg cell, it may be orgasmic when a sperm penetrates it. It may have a kind of, at cellular level, a sense of destiny or unity or achievement or amazing key moment. So I myself think that these kind of mystical type experiences of being part of something larger than oneself may be available to all sorts of organisms, at least some of the time. They're not available to us all the time, only some of the time, but I think they may be a key part of all life.
What do you think, Anil?
Yeah, I certainly don't. So I agree with actually a lot of that. I don't think being conscious inevitably means that the conscious system develops a belief in God at all. I think that requires a certain amount of cognitive corruption where we seek explanations for things that don't necessarily have explanations in that sense. But I really don't think we should try to build artificial consciousness, in fact, in the sense of like building an AI that has experiences. There's this sort of, again, I think, Silicon Valley tech bro rapture attitude that this would be a great thing to do. Like, you know, let's do this, let's build a conscious machine because maybe that's the breakthrough we need. I think it's very unlikely for the reasons that I was just explaining that you probably have to have a living machine first. But I might be wrong, of course, probably am wrong. Maybe it is possible. But it would be a terrible thing to do because as soon as you make something that has conscious experiences, you have a moral responsibility towards it. You don't even know whether it would be suffering or not. Maybe it would be suffering in a way you wouldn't even recognize because it wouldn't exhibit it in a way that we would naturally understand. And of course, these things could then exist at industrial scale. At the touch of a button, they flicker into existence in 1 billion server farms. This is not a cool thing to do, so don't build things just because you think you can. Yeah. So I'm very against that kind of narrative of let's try to do that. And even AI systems that merely seem conscious are already wreaking havoc in the world. Language models that are powered by deepfakes, people can't help projecting consciousness into them. You know, we are anthropomorphic like that. We project mind into our fridges sometimes. So no wonder we do it into GPT-4. Yeah. And that can be very psychologically destabilizing for us because either we care about these things and we know they're not conscious, in which case we sacrifice human and other animals' interests in the service of unfeeling hunks of silicon and code, or we learn to not care about them even though we still feel they are conscious, and that brutalizes our minds. Yeah. So there's even aside from the philosophical contention of its possibility, it again becomes an issue that matters ethically and morally.
So I think that, in fact, I now realize, I think, that the experience of consciousness does create something like a sense of God, whether or not the God exists. That the feeling of thought is power, and the sense that there is an action in the world, I think starts to carry with it the sense that there is an other responding to you and responding to. Even that mystical experience, if when the world breaks open, we don't know why the people have these experiences, but they have these moments in which something, suddenly time stops, their sense of self dissolves into the universe. They have a sense that they know something that they've never understood before, that they have a feeling of knowing, and it is beyond a feeling of anything that they can explain. Often that what comes with that is the sense of an other who directs, who guides, who manages. And so I think that I would bet on the machine developing a sense of God.
Ladies and gentlemen, it falls to me to be the baddie on the stage and tell you that we can't just carry on. I would like to, but I suspect someone back there would get very annoyed. So we have arrived at the point where if I could ask each of you to just give us some closing remarks in a couple of minutes. It's stated 3 minutes, actually. And Tanya, would you...
Oh, sure. I mean, I sort of feel like I've said everything that I intended to say, but I think that there's.
Has anything changed for you because of these two heresies?
Well, I mean, there's this observation that a conscious machine would have a God is a novel thought to me, and so I'm going to go away and think about it. But I think that the point that I would want to make to the audience is that these remarkable experiences in which people hear something, hear a person no one else can see, they feel the sense of a presence, they feel the universe break open, and they have a sort of Saul on the road to Damascus experience. Those experiences are relatively common, they're relatively powerful, they are deeply moving. Sometimes they're irrelevant, sometimes they're profoundly moving. There's an anthropologist called Godfrey Lienhart that described faith as, he said that there were the Dinka man. The Dinka are a pastoral community, pastoral people, or they were a pastoral people in southern Sudan. And he said that when a Dinka man is late going home to dinner, he'll tie a knot in a tuft of grass. And he doesn't believe that this knot is going to keep the sun from going down, but he believes that this is a way of externalizing his intention, and that the externalizing the intention is what changes him and causes him to believe, to act differently. And I think that that's what the experience of an external other does for people.
Thank you. Thank you. Rupert, have you?
Well, I love the fact that I'm sitting between, as it were, two extremes of, the brain, a neuroscientist and an anthropologist, with such different takes on consciousness, but which are very much part of any deeper understanding we come to, I think has to include both. And I love the fact that you're able to look at the way that different people experience these things differently, and they're not just experiences that happen to me, but experiences make a huge difference in their lives, so they take them seriously and they have serious effects. And any understanding of consciousness has to take into account these experiences, not only people's own consciousness, but their experiences of other kinds of consciousness. And I like the fact that Anil's approach to the brain and consciousness is to try and explain or connect conscious experiences with what's happening in the brain and look at them scientifically. And because I also like his idea of the real problem of looking at what we can look at scientifically. And I look at things which a lot of other scientists don't look at, but which I think are important ingredients in this, because I think we need to cast the net much wider. But I genuinely believe that through open-mindedly exploring these things, we can actually come to a deeper understanding of consciousness. And we're in a position that's unique, really, in the history of the world, because never before have we had access to all these different philosophical and religious traditions that we now have. We now know about all these different kinds of religion, theories of mind and consciousness and experience. We have this much more detailed experience of knowledge of brain structure and function of physical processes. And so, although we're far off an agreed and deeper understanding of consciousness, I'm hopeful that we're moving closer to one. And so in that sense, I think this debate's helpful because I think it's made me realize that there's more hope than I might have thought when I started when we came together, of actually moving forward to a deeper understanding.
Thank you.
Which could be useful and helpful to us.
Hello?
Thank you. Thanks both for a lovely discussion, and thanks for moderating it as well so beautifully. I think there are fascinating commonalities and disagreements, and I've learned a lot in recognizing this. So I'm very much on board with the importance of taking people's experiences seriously. And I've learned the variation in individual experiences of how people experience thoughts. That's something I hadn't thought about too much before. So that's something I'll take away. And there's also a surprising new commonality with Rupert, and it's a sense of the importance of self-organizing systems that I think is a common ground for understanding the connection between life, mind, and perhaps consciousness too. But I also think there are interesting divergences, and there's a divergence perhaps in the primacy we give to the content of people's experiences in sort of evidentiary terms. These experiences can be massively important for people's lives. This is absolutely the case. But when it comes to trying to understand what gives rise to these experiences, I will come back to this important distinction between taking them seriously but not taking them literally. And when it comes, and this I think is clear in these examples of the sense of being stared at, we should take those experiences seriously, but to take them literally, I think is a very different claim, and here's where I think a disagreement persists, because to take them literally would need overturning almost 400 years of accumulated worldview about how our universe works. And one doesn't want to do that without extremely good reason, but if it is necessary, one ought to do that, because at the core of science is a humility and a recognition that we will never have the full picture will never have direct access to truth. All we will have is evidence, and it's up to us to judge the importance of that evidence.
We'll just have a better controlled hallucination.
We will.
Then all it remains for me to do is to thank you for being such a lovely audience and turning up. And if you would join me in thanking our three panelists, Tanya, Rupert, and Aniel.
Thanks, Rupert.
And I work at a place called the Imaginary Institute, which is next to my bedroom, and it's where my dog likes to sleep. I work there. I can give myself any job title I like. I am an imaginary fellow. SIGGRAPH would like me to mention to you that you can take pictures, you can record, you can tweet, you can live tweet. You can't dance in the aisles. The file marshal doesn't like that. So we're here today to talk about deep learning. What I'm going to cover are concepts and terminology and structures. I'm not going to give you math, and I'm not going to give you code, because I don't think those are things that we can absorb quickly, particularly in an environment like this. So I'm going to give you the ideas that you need to understand this field, and then if you want to know the particulars, you will be able to go to many of the resources available and enjoy all the math and all the code to your heart's content. And there's plenty of that out there, and I strongly encourage you to do so. You won't be needing to write much of your own deep learning code, because one of the beautiful things about this field is that free open source libraries do most of the heavy lifting for us. These are libraries that have been built by teams of experts, and they do an enormous amount of work, from getting things ready for GPUs, to worrying about numerical stability, to worrying about floating point accuracy, and they take care of all of that for us, so we can focus on the conceptual work. So following in that spirit, we're going to focus on concepts, and we'll let the systems do the work for us. And the good news about those libraries is that they're available in a wide multitude of languages and operating systems. So whatever your favorite way of working is, you can probably find a free library to help you work that way. So this is called a crash course. And that name, I hope, tipped you off. Crashes are not quiet and gentle and smooth and easy. We're gonna cover a lot of stuff, and we're gonna do it fast. I'm gonna try to squeeze a 1-semester course, at least, into 3 hours for you. You're not gonna walk out experts ready to write code, but you'll walk out very well informed, ready to become experts who write code. You'll certainly be well enough informed to talk to those experts, and you'll be well enough informed to attend some of the wonderful papers that are coming up this week and to read other papers online and understand what they're talking about. So those are our goals. We're going to talk about concepts and terminology. We'll talk about algorithms, but not in detail. And we'll talk about applications at the very end. So what is this deep learning thing? Well, let's think of science as being the study of phenomena, including man-made phenomena. And inside of that is artificial intelligence, which is nebulously defined. Every time we say, this is what it makes for intelligence, then a computer or a dog or an orca whale comes along and does that. And so we say, nah, that wasn't intelligent. Intelligence is over here. So you could argue either we're moving the goalposts or we're sharpening up our focus of what it means to be intelligent. If you have an opinion on that, feel free to discuss it over dinner. Inside of artificial intelligence, which is the system for trying to figure out how to encode intelligence into a man-made device, whether it's analog or digital or biological, we have machine learning, which is a class of algorithms. Machine learning has been around for decades, and there's a wide variety of algorithms that try to implement some version of intelligence, some version of understanding information hidden inside of data. Finally, we have deep learning. Deep learning is not a thing. It is a class of algorithms that have been developed over the last couple of decades that have proven themselves to be enormously powerful. And you probably know that because you're here at a class called deep learning. So deep learning is not a thing. It's not like path tracing. Deep learning is an approach. It is a structural way of trying to do machine learning, which is a structural way of doing artificial intelligence, which is one way of doing science. What is intelligence? Well, let's just think about general things before we dig in. It's the ability to reason about things, being able to logically make inferences. I know this, what else do I know? It's the ability to learn. Do I know something today that I didn't know yesterday? If so, that's pretty good intelligence. Can I plan? If I have something I need to do, can I work out the steps to get there? And can I solve a problem? Whether that problem is as simple as continuing to exist or eat food, or as rarefied as extracting a particular kind of information from a set of numerical data. Here are some things that we can do with deep learning and that people have done with deep learning. Let's just look at a bunch of quick applications before we dig in, so we're all on the same page. The post office needs to sort mail, so they've got to look at the zip code in the bottom right-hand corner. In the United States, we use a 5 or 9-digit zip code, and they're usually hand-drawn. So the post office wants a computer to be able to look at the envelope and figure out what those 5 digits are, and it wants to do it with extremely high accuracy and reliability. When you write a check, the bank wants to look at the numbers written in the upper corner and the words that you write in the middle. Those words are written in print, they're written in script, they're written with people scrawling, they're written with clear text, they're written by left-handers and right-handers. If you've ever tried to read a stranger's handwriting, you know what a challenge it is for a human to read a piece of handwriting. Imagine how hard it is for a computer, but we want computers to do this, and indeed, they're very good at it. Deep learning, of course, is able to do facial recognition. It can look at a picture of someone it has never seen in that form before. Different lighting, they're wearing a hat, there's shadows falling on their face, they're turned away, maybe they have some facial hair, and the system can say, that's a face, that's a person, that's a man, that's a 24-year-old man, that's your friend Bob. That's pretty amazing. That's one of the things we can do with deep learning. We can talk to our digital assistants. We have vibrations in the air. They turn into phonemes. The phonemes can be grouped into words, and then words can be grouped into a concept. Again, deep learning can do all of this. Physicists are generating petabytes of data, and they want to look through this mind-boggling huge amount of data, and they want to find the